The Dark Montana timeline is a chronologically ordered journey through some of the most unsettling, fascinating, and downright creepy moments in Montana's history. Over the past year, I've covered more than 20 stories, frontier disappearances, strange cryptid encounters, unsolved cases that still haunt investigators, and some of the darkest crimes ever recorded in Montana. For longtime viewers, you will recognize many of these stories, but seeing them all laid out in order adds a new layer of context to seeing how some of Montana's most mysterious chapters unfolded. This timeline stretches back from the 1800s all the way to modern day. I've tightened up the pacing, removed all the filler, and added timestamps so you can jump to any story you want. If you want more long-form, in-depth Montana storytelling just like this, subscribing and hitting like right now genuinely helps me keep making Montana history projects just like these. This is part 1 of 2 because the full-length Dark Montana timeline is over 7 hours long. So today, we're starting at the very beginning. So grab a drink, put on some headphones, and let's get into some of Montana's darkest history.
Tales of mysterious creatures unknown to man and science has been around for a very long time. One of the most famous of these creatures is Bigfoot, otherwise known as Sasquatch. There are many accounts of Bigfoot, ranging from historical to modern video and photo evidence of the creature. Me, myself, I'm a little skeptical of the existence of a modern Bigfoot, just like how I'm skeptical of most ghost stories. However, I find them very fascinating, and honestly, I do enjoy the occasional History Channel episode of Finding Bigfoot. One of the most interesting sightings of Bigfoot actually comes from a United States president, that president being Theodore Roosevelt. In this video, I'm going to go over Theodore Roosevelt's account of Bigfoot in a novel that he wrote called The Wilderness Hunter, as well as look at some of the more modern tellings of people encountering Bigfoot, which are a little bit more humorous than Theodore Roosevelt's. Theodore Roosevelt's is a very well-written account of an old hunter/tracker running into an unknown creature, not even labeled Bigfoot, although we can account it to Bigfoot. We'll get into that later. And it is very honestly unsettling and scary. This encounter with Bigfoot takes place on the border between Idaho and Montana. And as this is Montana after midnight, I thought it'd be cool to go into the most famous Bigfoot sighting written down by a US president that happened in Montana. I hope you guys enjoy. Let's get into it. If you guys are new to the channel, this is Montana After Midnight, where we go over creepy, mysterious, paranormal things that happened in the Big Sky state of Montana. This is the third big video that I've done on this channel, the others being a trip to Garnet Ghost Town, one of the most historical and well-preserved ghost towns in the state of Montana, as well as a description/documentary on the night of the Grizzlies. Both of these videos are very entertaining, and I highly recommend you check them out after this video is done. This video, however, focuses on Bigfoot sightings in Montana. If this sounds interesting to you, make sure to subscribe, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the video. Before I get into the story written by Theodore Roosevelt in his book, The Wilderness Hunter, which is a story that recounts an old trapper's younger days where he ran into a mysterious figure, I want to go over some facts about Theodore Roosevelt and the location where this sighting apparently occurred. As it's been a while since my 8th grade history class, I wanted to look up and reevaluate some facts about Theodore Roosevelt. Some of them are pretty freaking crazy. One, which I remember hearing from my teacher who explained that Theodore Roosevelt was his favorite president, was that he was shot and then proceeded to give a speech after he was shot, knowing that he wasn't going to fatally die due to his hunting and wilderness experience, which makes sense because Theodore Roosevelt wrote very many books about hunting and surviving for a woodland man. I don't know if that's a good term to use, but woodland man. Theodore Roosevelt also won a Nobel Prize, and unfortunately, his wife and mother died on the same day, which is extremely tragic. Maybe that's not a fun fact, but an interesting fact. Maybe a sad fact. We'll call that one a sad fact. Another fact that really surprised me was that he was the youngest president ever, which I would not pin him for. I would think maybe Kennedy was the youngest president ever, but in fact, it was Theodore Roosevelt. The final thing about Theodore Roosevelt is that he had a ranch in North Dakota. He really fit this cowboy aesthetic more so than any other president that I've looked up and seen, which I think is really cool, and also kind of ties into the whole Montana theme of this YouTube channel, and of course, this story taking place in Montana. Before diving into Theodore Roosevelt's Bigfoot story, I wanted to look at the origin or lore of Bigfoot in modern-day North America. I'm getting all this information from the History Channel, which is kind of ironic because the History Channel always makes these ancient aliens / finding Bigfoot shows, but I'm getting the history or lore from the History Channel's website. Sasquatch actually predates Bigfoot being more of a Canadian folktale that goes back to the early 1900s, 1930s, where Bigfoot actually starts in the 1950s. It was actually 1958 where some loggers found some footprints that they could not identify, which they said belonged to a Bigfoot. This was then written in an article by Andrew Gonzalez. Andrew said that he didn't think this story was going to get as popular as it did, making for a good Sunday morning news article, but instead it caught the nation by storm. Eventually, even TV shows were offering rewards for finding Bigfoot. One TV show named Truth or Consequence offered a $1,000 reward for evidence of Bigfoot. From there, in the 1970s, there was paperback novels, magazines, and even some documentaries going over the man-beast, the creature of the night, Bigfoot, where in the 80s, it seems like Bigfoot found his softer side in the media, where people thought of him as more of a creature tied to the environment and a natural animal in the wilderness. Of course, Bigfoot is still debated to this day if he is real or if he is just a man-made hoax. And now in hindsight, looking at some historical accounts like the Theodore Roosevelt story of Bauman the trapper in the Montana/Idaho woods, did they run into Bigfoot as this unknown creature that did not have a name yet? Now let's talk about the story where Theodore Roosevelt supposedly wrote about Bigfoot. It's important to say that the monster was not called Bigfoot in this story, and it isn't Theodore Roosevelt's first-hand account of seeing Bigfoot, although there is some theory crafting that we can get into later after reading the story. The person that actually saw and dealt with this shadowy creature was a man named Bauman. Bauman was a young trapper at the time who had a partner that decided to trap near the Salmon River. This was a river that bordered between Idaho and Montana. Bauman and his partner decided to trap on a new trail that they had never been up before. There was even a story about a man last year being mauled to death by a beast up this trail. Both of these men, being experienced and not weak-willed, weren't very scared of this story and decided to continue on the path. They rode up a portion of the path, but had to leave their horses behind when there was a more climbing-intensive section. They hiked for a couple hours, finally deciding on a spot to make camp. The location where they decided to make their camp was near a stream, which they spent the rest of the daylight hours exploring, walking up the stream and then eventually coming back to camp. While they were walking up the stream, in those couple hours that they were gone, they realized that their camp had been raided. The likely culprit of the creature rummaging through their camp would have been a grizzly or a black bear, both very common in Montana and not necessarily an uncommon thing for them to do. In fact, nowadays there are a lot of rules when camping out in the wilderness in bear country, a lot of them being not to cook food at your campsite and to keep your food at least 100 yards away and tied up in a tree or in your car. We also nowadays have the pack in, pack out rules, which if you want to know why those are a thing, I highly recommend watching my Night of the Grizzlies video. The men, of course, being frustrated with their camp being rummaged through, put everything back into normal order, and then took a closer inspection at the footprints. These footprints did not seem to be those of a bear, and more interestingly, it did not seem like this creature was walking on 4 legs, but instead 2. And I imagine that they're able to distinguish this because they are experienced trappers, and you'll be able to tell if they're walking on 2 legs or 4. And in the story, it says that this creature was definitely walking on 2 legs. Also, it's important to say that at this point in the story, it is alluded to that these could not be human feet. It must be some other creature entirely. After fixing up the camp, it was late and both men decided to retire for the night. In the middle of the night, Bauman woke up to a beastly smell and a shadowy figure standing outside of his lean-to. That's where he reached for his rifle, pulled it out, took a shot, and the beast rushed into the night. There is no clear depiction of what the beast looked like, but that it was a shadowy, tall figure standing over him. The next day, the men woke up and had to check their beaver traps that they set up along the stream the day prior. While checking all of the traps, they stuck very close together, scared of whatever else was out there. Returning to their camp in the evening, they find it completely ran through again, trashed by whatever this creature was that was stalking them. They decided that one person should stay up by the fire, keeping it roaring while the others slept, taking turns throughout the night. Around midnight, the men could hear the creature stirring around their camp, every once in a while from the shadows, making a deep, grating moan, which they found, of course, to be extremely unsettling. Fortunately for them, they did not encounter the beast that night and woke up the next morning deciding that they needed to get far away from that camp. However, they needed to collect their traps, which were still laid out along the stream in a nearby pond. So the men, sticking together, went down the stream and picked up each of their traps. While collecting their traps, there was a sense that they were being watched, and the occasional sound could be heard from behind them, but ultimately they felt safe in the daylight. Around noon, with the sun high in the sky, it actually felt kind of silly to these experienced wilderness men that they were so scared to be in the woods. And with only 3 traps remaining, Bowerman elected to go recover them himself from a nearby pond, while his partner would collect all their things at camp so they'd be ready to leave. For the first time in this trip, they actually caught beavers in their traps. There was a beaver in each one of the 3 that were laid out in this pond that Bowerman went to collect, which meant that he had to clean and organize his kills so that they would be preserved and ready for the trip back. This took him a couple of hours to do, and by the time he was done, it was starting to get dark out. This, of course, made him feel uneasy as he rushed to get back to his partner at camp. As Bauman got closer to camp, he started yelling, but heard no response, and that the fire had been untended to, eventually going out, and his partner was nowhere to be seen. As Bauman moved and looked through the camp, he eventually found his friend laying on a fallen tree. The body still warm, but his neck broken and twisted. There was also fang marks found on his throat. The beast footprints seemed to tell the story. Bauman's partner had packed up camp and decided to rest on the fallen tree, facing the fire and away from the woods. The beast, walking on 2 legs, silently crept up behind him, eventually twisting his neck back, breaking it, and killing his partner. Then the beast dug its fangs into his partner's neck, sucking some of its blood out, but not eating his partner, instead deciding to roll and romp around his corpse, sometimes even rolling and smashing into it, only to scurry into the night before Bauman was able to make it back to camp. At this point, Bauman picked up his rifle and with only that ran all the way back to where he left his pony tied up and then rode the pony down the path further away from this beastly creature that has taken his partner's life. And that right there is the end to the story that Theodore Roosevelt wrote about Bauman in The Wilderness Hunter. Now, there are a couple comments that I want to make about this particular story. One is that with the history lesson that I gave you on Bigfoot earlier, you would know that this was written before Bigfoot really got his name. So this creature goes unlabeled, just being a black shadowy figure that stands on two legs. It's also alluded to in the beginning of the story that the creature could be goblin-like due to Bauman's German ancestry and how he kind of played off of German folklore, making him think it was more goblin-esque than Bigfoot-esque. However, it is still widely regarded as the time Theodore Roosevelt mentioned Bigfoot, the time a president of the United States wrote about Bigfoot. Kind of cool, definitely an interesting fact, and a little interesting tidbit of Montana history, knowing that a president believed a man enough to add it to one of his hunting and wilderness books that there's a Bigfoot-like creature roaming around by the Salmon River. Now, as always, I'm going to leave all my sources in the comments so you can check out those individual videos, which includes a couple different YouTube videos that read the actual story that Theodore Roosevelt wrote. And I'm also going to be citing the PDF version of Theodore Roosevelt's The Wilderness Hunter because it is actually out there. That's how old this book is. And you guys can look at the story yourself. Also, in one of the videos that I watched, they talked about the fact that Bauman could be a stand-in for young Theodore Roosevelt himself. Bauman and Theodore Roosevelt, when writing The Wilderness Hunter, were both older men. However, this is Bauman's story of when he was a younger, less experienced trapper, which people have concluded this may actually be Theodore Roosevelt putting a stand-in so it's not directly tied to his name. There are a couple reasons for this, mainly because the way that this story was written was unique and slightly out of flavor for the rest of the book. In terms of the book, I've only read about the first 2 chapters, and like I said, it was very well written, and I might continue reading it, and I'm excited to get to the chapter to see for myself if I actually believe that it is different and out of character, and maybe there is something to Bauman actually being Theodore Roosevelt. But going off of face value, this is just Bauman's story that Theodore Roosevelt trusted enough to write about. Overall, in terms of Bigfoot stories, I really like this one. For one, it was written very well. Another thing is the creature isn't super well described, similar to the original Bigfoot story where they just found footprints at a logging site. The most detail we get about this creature is that its footprints were in their campsite, and its footprints told the story of Bauman's friend being mauled to death. This is opposed to snapshot photos of a random brown spot in the middle of a field, or a grandiose story written about how someone shook hands with Bigfoot that you get nowadays. Instead, we get a scary story, maybe even a good campfire story to tell if you're ever in that situation, of a mysterious monster coming in the middle of the night, stalking these 2 experienced men, leaving only one of them alive to tell the tale. This first one is a video of people checking out their night vision camera when all of a sudden a creature runs across their screen.
It's a screen. Look at that. You can literally drive the car with your lights off. Usually, it's what's that on the right side, dude? Get me the hell off this truck. Stop so I can get in the truck. What the hell is that thing? Open the door.
Now, of course, this one is a little over dramatic. It's a quick clip. It's fun. It got a lot of views. And of course, in the comments, everyone is saying that it is fake. More interestingly, there's this video that to me seems almost AI. It's either an old guy that has never talked online before and is trying to sound real and good, or it is literally just AI.
I seen a Bigfoot about 2 years ago on the Blackfeet Reservation in Montana. Tried getting a video, but it wouldn't focus. But we did get a few pictures.
However, in this video, which is literally him just driving down a Montana back road that has a clip at the end that supposedly you see Bigfoot, which I don't really see him.
It was definitely something to see, and the pictures tell many stories.
All the comments are super favorable, or at least the ones that I saw when I found it, saying things like, "Thank you for sharing this," and "You basically can't keep Bigfoot a secret." Interesting to see these two different types of videos coming out in Montana about Bigfoot in a more modern day. But in a juxtaposition to this Theodore Roosevelt story, it makes me appreciate it and how well of a writer Theodore Roosevelt was. And I actually have a goal of owning my own copy of The Wilderness Hunter because it was such a fun read and I did enjoy making this video. Have you seen this woman? Her name is Elizabeth, or Elsie Macklin, and she has been going all around the internet. So much so that my sister, who absolutely loves the channel, sent me a link to the post so I would talk about it in one of my videos. And now her story is extremely interesting, but there is something slightly off about it. I'm going to briefly read you the story, and then we're going to go into this crazy conspiracy that I crafted all about Elsie Macklin. The Widow of Elk Creek. A trapper's wife deep in the Montana winter, Beartooth Mountains, Montana Territory, 1886 through 1887. She came west for love, and she stayed alive for spite. When the snow came early and the grizzlies stayed late, she loaded up the rifle, boiled the bones, and kept the fire going. The edge of civilization, the Beartooth Range was no place for comfort. It was 9,000 feet up and weeks from the nearest town. A place of ice winds, rock slide paths, and silent forest. Trapped between grizzlies, wolves, starvation, and most who lived there were fur trappers or seasonal hands. But in 1884, Elizabeth Elsie Macklin, age 24, left Kansas to marry a trapper named John, who built a 2-room cabin at the mouth of Elk Creek. For 2 years, they ran trap lines and traded pelts for flour, bullets, and coffee beans. Then, in October of 1886, John went upriver to hunt beaver. He never came back. Alone before the freeze, Elsie waited. A day and then a week. By the time she lit out to search, snow had already begun to fall. She found his pack torn open near a frozen bend. No body, just blood. Just claw marks on a tree 10 feet high. 6 months of silence. From November to April, Elsie reset his trap lines, boiled pine needles for vitamin C, shot and butchered a bear that tried to break into the smokehouse, burned the pages of an old Bible for fire starter, fixed her own snowshoe 3 times, and patched a frostbite blackened toe with bear grease and muslin. She spoke aloud only to the wind. Her dog Tuck froze to death in February. She wrapped him up in a flannel and buried him underneath the cabin floor. Rescue comes late. A pair of traders stumble into her cabin in late April, expecting it to be abandoned. Instead, they found a woman 20 pounds thinner with a loaded rifle across her lap and a line of smoked beaver pelts hanging above the stove, and a bear skull nailed to the door with the words, "I stayed." Legacy. Elsie returned to Kansas that summer. She never remarried. She opened a general store where she sold snares and taught girls how to skin rabbits. Locals called her the Elk Widow, and when she died in 1919, her coffin was lined with the fur she trapped herself. Pretty interesting story about a woman showing real Western grit back in the 1800s, right? Now, this was a period during the Great Die-Up, which is a play on words for a Great Roundup, because it had to do with cattle, and the cattle, well, died. The Great Die-Up. So many cattle were lost during this period. It was actually a 2-winter or 3-year stretch where the conditions were just so harsh that many ranchers went bankrupt, including Theodore Roosevelt, and a lot of cattle died. And just like this story, a lot of people lost their lives as well. In the most extreme cases, the Great Die-Up actually changed how cattle ranching was done as a whole. The one problem with Elizabeth or Elsie Macklin's story is she's not real. Well, except for on Facebook, of course. You see, I did a little bit of research after getting sent this post. I was looking for new YouTube video ideas after I created my most recent video, and I remember my sister sent me a text with this post linked inside of it. And so when I'm doing research for things, the first thing I do is I will just simply Google them. But the thing is, when you Google Elizabeth Macklin's name, all you get is the exact same post that my sister sent me, just reposted over and over and over again. You guys know how the internet is. Everyone's just copying everybody else. And this one is just literally copy and pasting the same text over and over and using the same image. It goes so far that this image is even on LinkedIn, with people commenting about how brave and strong this Montana legendary woman was. Some of the comments word for word are things like, "True American grit," and insert more comments here. Great job taking notes, Devin. Now, after I saw the same post over and over again when I looked up Elizabeth Macklin, I went a little bit deeper and I couldn't find a Wikipedia page about her or any historical evidence of this person ever existing. I'm sure there's been Elizabeth Macklins around, but not in the Montana Beartooth. No legend of her going back to Kansas or ever existing during the Great Die-Up in Montana, except for there was a post to findagrave.com which listed Elsie Macklin around this time period. So of course I go to that website, finally finding something about an Elsie Macklin, and of course it is word for word the exact same post that's on Facebook, LinkedIn, and pretty much anywhere on the website. I'm sure it's on Pinterest too. And once you scroll down further on the website, you find the date that it was added, and it says August 2025. So a very recent new discovery of Elsie Macklin, which is actually after some of the posts that are on Facebook and LinkedIn coming even earlier within the year of 2025. Now, while I did a whole bunch of research on the internet, something internally was setting off alarm bells within myself. And that is the fact that I've read this story before, or at least a story very, very similar to Elizabeth Macklin. And that story belongs to Cowboys, Mountain Men, and Grizzly Bears. This is a book that I bought, hopefully to talk about on the YouTube channel, about Montana legends and historical things that have happened in Montana that I find interesting that would fit well on my channel, which I feel like all three of those things do. So I went through all my highlighted sections to find the Montana story of a woman surviving in the Great Die-Up, just like Elizabeth Macklin, and I found Winter Kill. It is literally the last Montana story that I have highlighted in this book. So Winter Kill is a historical fiction story about what it might be to be someone in the POV during the Great Die-Up of 1886 to 1887. Winter Kill is the story of Arlene Barr, whose husband Joseph decides to go check on the cattle in the middle of January during a crazy snowstorm, basically betting it all that he needs his cattle to survive because without the cattle, the ranch will go under. After listening to the Elsie Macklin post, I'm sure you know where this story is going. He never made it back. I think it's pretty clear that Winter Kill then inspired the Elizabeth Macklin post. There are so many similarities. This story came out first and is in much more detail, although there are some key differences that I'll highlight for you really quickly. And you could say that maybe they didn't completely rip this off. Maybe they just kind of ripped and twisted the story. But we're going to get more into that in a little bit. For now, let's just talk about the differences. Also, quick aside, if you guys are interested in hearing more Montana legends within this book, I have 8 highlighted that I could go over and cover. So if this is the kind of thing that you're into, let me know and I'll make another video about some of these stories. And if you're new here, make sure to subscribe because I talk about a lot of interesting Montana history, paranormal stuff, to true crime, to natural disasters. I pretty much cover it all. As long as I find it interesting and it relates to Montana, I talk about it. So highly recommend subscribing. Okay, so in the Elizabeth Macklin post, she is the wife of a trapper, and he goes out to check some beaver traps when he is attacked by a grizzly bear, and she becomes a fierce mountain woman of her own, even killing grizzly bears until she is eventually rescued by some trappers, and she goes back to Kansas. However, in Winter Kill, which I will actually post a link to this full story because it came out in the Big Sky Journal before it was featured in this book, her husband actually passes away due to the elements, freezing to death, getting turned around in a blizzard, instead of being attacked by a grizzly bear. The perspective changes halfway through the story to 2 other ranchers in the area who are walking around in the spring when they eventually come upon her husband's body. Then they talk about how she's gone mad after her husband died, and they decide to bring his frozen body, now de-thawing, to her to alleviate some of her grief, even though it's probably not going to work because she has gone fully insane due to his death. Another significant difference is that Arlene Barr loses a baby in her story. The men talk about how it passed away soon after the husband died in the blizzard, and that her house actually collapsed in on itself, although she is still alive. While in the post that is circling around, the lady isn't necessarily mentioned to go mad. She actually becomes kind of a mountain woman of her own, and her dog passes away as opposed to Arlene Barr, who has a child pass away, which is a pretty significant difference, although the theming of loss is still there. And I find it really fascinating that these are basically the same story, albeit told in drastically different ways. One is a matter-of-fact post about this Montana legend of a woman, and it's all like in her perspective. It's just kind of detailed facts about her. And then the other story is more narrative, it's drawn out, and the point of view actually shifts halfway through. Also, the character of the woman, one becoming a badass mountain woman, and then the other going mad with the loss of her husband and baby. Those are drastically different, but the setup and the setting are exactly the same. What really sent me down this rabbit hole was the amount of people within the comments talking about the American grit that Elizabeth Macklin showed, treating her as if she was a real person. And I think the point of the post was to basically bait and get as many comments as possible. And I would say 80% of the comments are just, wow, what an amazing woman. Thank you for sharing this story. And then 20% of the comments are talking about how it's not real. And a majority of those 20% of the comments actually come from certain posts that involve this story where they used a different image, because all of these posts have an image of Elizabeth Macklin, but some of them have a black and white kind of, roughed up image of Elizabeth Macklin outside of her cabin. And then other posts have an in color, clearly AI photo of Elizabeth Macklin, which now feels like a great time to tell you that literally all the images that are tied to this story are AI. I wouldn't be surprised if someone fed the story that's in this book / in the Big Sky Journal Winterkill, if they just took that story, put it in ChatGPT and said, turn this into an engaging post, change up some of the elements, make it more empowering. Boom, they got an AI script, put an AI image, and just started posting it all around the internet. Other people realized that it was getting traction, so they took it. All these Facebook accounts that are just like fascinating history. Boom, here's the story of this woman, not realizing or not caring that it was all made up in the first place. And to reiterate really quickly, the story in this book is historical fiction. Arlene Barr also never existed. It was just a story that was meant to put you in the perspective of someone surviving during the Great Die-Up, calling to your attention this historical event that happened that affected so many different ranchers. The final nail in the coffin for this Elizabeth Macklin story was the Find a Grave website. The fact that it was posted there at a later date than what was posted on Facebook, the AI image plus the exact same story that was posted on Facebook, on LinkedIn. They didn't change any of the facts to make it seem real. They didn't write paragraphs. It was just copy and paste the exact same story. So I can say without a doubt that Elizabeth Macklin, in the form of the story that was told on Facebook, LinkedIn, findagrave.com, never existed, although I'm sure there was other Elizabeth Macklins out there. Maybe in 1920 there was an awesome lady named Elizabeth Macklin, but not during the Great Die-Up in Montana. Internet scandal that no one cared about aside, I do want to take a few moments to talk about the Great Die-Up, so there's a little bit of historical information within this video, because that's what we do here. We talk about interesting Montana history. So let's quickly talk about the Great Die-Up. The Great Die-Up, otherwise known as the Big Die-Up, which was a set of winters in the late 1800s, roughly 1885 through 1887 or 8, where the cattle industry really suffered due to a couple of harsh winters. This led a lot of cattle ranchers to lose their entire herd, go bankrupt, and in extreme cases die. Some interesting numbers to go along with this really harsh period. In late December 1886, the weather took a turn for the worst, getting as cold as negative 35 degrees in Glendive, Montana. Really think about that, negative 35 degrees. That's cold enough to freeze water twice over. Maybe, I don't exactly know how that works, but it's really cold. And another fun fact, in February, it snowed almost 4 inches in San Francisco, setting a record high for snowfall in the area. To show you just how drastically the loss of life in terms of the herds of cattle is, ranchers were estimated to lose anywhere between 50 and 90% of their cattle. Like I mentioned earlier in this video, Theodore Roosevelt suffered a great loss at his ranch because of the great die-up, and he wrote this in a letter to his friend. "The losses are crippling. For the first time, I've been utterly unable to enjoy a visit to my ranch. I shall be glad to get home." Which sounds pretty depressing. I mean, I guess if you lose all of your cattle, that would be pretty sad. So even one of our presidents was affected by this. Despite the losses and poor conditions at the beginning of the Great Die-Up, the plains did actually recover quite quickly. This was due to the number of cattle shrinking in the area because they all passed away, and favorable weather conditions, so cattle were able to bounce back in just a couple of years. Although cattle ranching culture was forever changed, now smaller scale cattle ranches seem to kind of disappear, being replaced with larger scale operations. Also, the days of free roam cattle slowly dwindled, where now a more hands-on approach to cattle ranching took over. This was supplying shelter, food, and water to the cattle instead of letting them just kind of roam. Basically, the industry of cattle ranching changed from a gamble on a small scale to a business operation on a much larger scale in general throughout the West. And there you have the Great Die-Up, a piece of Western U.S. history that I had never really known or cared too much about. Even when I read Winter Kill, I didn't think for 2 seconds about the Great or Big Die-Up, and it wasn't until I saw this random Facebook post about a mountain woman that never existed that I could sense something wrong with that I decided to do a deep dive into it. And I'm glad I did, and I guess in a weird way, I'm glad that that post exists, even though I think it's very AI and it's not true U.S. history. I don't believe that woman actually existed, just like Arlene Burr also never existed. So Montana is known to have their own little subset of cryptids. There are some of the classic stories like Bigfoot or a skinwalker, but they're kind of known for being a part of other regions as well. However, there is one cryptid that is very specific to Montana, which is the Shukana Warkinen, known as the Shukana Warkinen, otherwise known as the Rocky Mountain Hyena. I'm gonna guess how to say the Shukana Warkinen the entire time, and then when I'm editing, I'll check and I'll see that I've been saying it wrong the whole time. I should really be more proactive about this. But anyway, I'm basically going to call it the Rocky Mountain Hyena for the majority of the video, and as you could probably tell by my terrible pronunciation of the name, it is actually Native American in origin, and there is a story of this four-legged wolf-like beast that comes in and it steals the tribe's dogs. And apparently Shukanoarkanen is the name that they gave it, and it means like dog getter, dog stealer, evil dog stealer beast is what it means apparently. And this beast is also often compared to a hyena, which of course is a creature known in Africa right now. What makes this beast so interesting is that obviously there's not supposed to be a hyena-like creature in North America. What really caught my eye with this specific cryptid is the fact that there's actually one in a museum. Here's a picture of this creature. It actually is right there, which is quite unique for a cryptid creature. There's no like stuffed Bigfoot in any museum, so it's fairly unique that we have a cryptid creature, but it's on display. So basically the lore of this creature is that a jaggedy beast thing is coming into Montana ranches and just absolutely messing with people's herds. If I would have known about it when I was making my recent video on cattle mutilations, that would have been awesome. But unfortunately, I didn't plan the videos out accordingly, and I found out about the Shakana later. All the way back in the 1800s, there is a cattle rancher named Israel Hutchins who has a problem with this canine-like beast that is attacking his livestock. He hears it throughout the night, preying on his herd. The article that I found is from Atlas Obscura, and it's honestly a really good article. It does exactly what I need it to do. It gives me a great history on this beast, and it gives a description from Israel Hutchins, the man that ended up encountering and shooting this Shakana Warkanen, and the reason why we have a stuffed version of it today. And his description is the beast had a dark coat, high shoulders, and a slanted back. In doing other research for this video, like watching other YouTubers make stuff and reading some other articles, that high shoulders, slanted back, that's pretty much par for the course of what describes this creature. Again, it's different from a wolf distinctly, and it's also not a dog. It's a weird, creepy beast, guys. It is not your it is not a coyote, okay? It is its own crazy beast. Yes. But what's hilarious about Hutchins' encounter with this beast is that he ends up actually shooting at it. I have my own creature, my own beast, my own Shakana Wakanen here with me today. Her name's Remy, as you can see her. Kind of creepy. But Hutchins actually takes aim at this mysterious creature, shooting at it only to kill one of his own cows, which is hilarious because you're worried about this mysterious creature coming in and killing your herd, and when you take aim and shoot at it, you end up killing your own cow. Awesome. That's sick. But days pass, and this Rocky Mountain hyena shows up again. He's able to take aim, find it in his sights, and kill the Rocky Mountain hyena. What's the first thing you do when you kill a mysterious creature that has been hunting your cows down? You sell it right away to some random businessman for one more cow. So he kind of made out like, okay, I guess. You kill one of your cows, but then you can sell the thing you're hunting for another cow. The businessman that he decided to sell the carcass to was named Joseph Sherwood, and this is the darkest part of the story. He's actually from Idaho. So he takes this Montana mythical legend and he brings it to Idaho. Joseph Sherwood is actually a taxidermist in his own right, so he's able to mount this beast and actually hang it up in his grocery store / museum, which is something I love about American small towns. If you get rural enough, you'll get these dual purpose, this is my business, and we're also kind of an antique store museum type thing. They're just like all over the place. I've done road trips through the South, and you get to this awesome, like, big fish and game store, and then the basement is just antique / museum from every single war America's ever been a part of. And I'm guessing this was just another small town American grocery store / museum where now this Shakana Wakanen, I'm still saying it wrong, I can guarantee it, it was just mounted. And it stayed mounted up until the 1980s, where it mysteriously went missing. Also, why I'm saying that it's tragic that the Montana hyena was taken to Idaho is because I've made a whole bunch of videos on Montana. It's actually kind of the point of my channel. Thanks for watching, by the way. But a lot of my videos border on like Idaho and Wyoming. The most recent video I just made was on the Yellowstone earthquake, which technically did happen in Montana. But if you're familiar, Yellowstone is mainly in like Wyoming. My roommate especially was giving me crap about making a video for Montana After Midnight about Yellowstone National Park, but it counts. It technically was in Montana. It was a Montana earthquake, and this is a Montana cryptid. I don't want to hear anything about it. Also, my best friend lives in Idaho, so it's all love. It's all love. It's just when I make creepy videos about Montana, I don't want to hear that Idaho actually owns all the creepy cool stuff. But like I said, even more unfortunate that they stole our Rocky Mountain hyena to Idaho is the fact that it went missing in the 1980s. I cannot describe how disappointing I was when I found out this fact when I was reading it in this article and other articles as well. It's just like, it was mounted. We did have this creature stuffed and taxidermied, ready for anyone to look at. It is the Bigfoot of Montana, and we have it in person, but it went missing. All we have is a picture now. That's so dumb and so stupid, is what I would say if this Rocky Mountain hyena wasn't eventually recovered. I was expecting it to be lost to history forever because it would kind of be convenient if this cryptid went away so no one could ever question its authenticness. But no, it actually disappeared, and then the farmer, Israel Hutchins, had a grandson who went back to Idaho and found the original taxidermied Rocky Mountain hyena. And apparently, kind of like just an Indiana Jones movie or something like that, it was just in a basement with a cloth over it, and he like picked up the cloth, and there it is. There is this beast of unknown origin, a legendary cryptid ready to be discovered again. So shout out Jack Kirby, the original rancher who shot the Rocky Mountain hyena's grandson, for showing up and eventually finding the Rocky Mountain hyena once again. Kirby was then able to convince the people that technically owned the taxidermied carcass of the Rocky Mountain hyena to let him take it to Montana and put it in a history museum in Ennis, which is also kind of interesting because when I was talking about how Idaho and Montana kind of share a lot of these creepy stories, Ennis was a town that was almost completely flooded and destroyed by the Yellowstone earthquake, which I just made a video on. And this carcass is still being shown off in Ennis, Montana to this day. However, before Kirby brought the carcass to Ennis from Idaho, he decided to stop by his grandpa's grave to reunite the two dead carcasses together again for one last time, supposedly, which is awesome, I guess, or weird, and probably weird, but you could think it's awesome. I'll let you think that. And I think somewhere in here there's like this hidden gem of one of those like corny dog movies. Like instead of Marley and Me, it's dude that shot mythical creature and that stuffed dead taxidermy carcass hanging out in a grave site. I don't know. I think it has potential. That's potential. Anyway, right now in Ennis, you guys can go look at this creature still stuffed taxidermied in its original state, and it is simply known as the Beast. The article concludes by talking about what actually is this taxidermied beast that we now have in Ennis, Montana. Is it a half-breed between two different canine creatures? Is it actually this Native American legend called the Shakana Warkanin, or is it something else entirely? Me specifically, well, I think a lot of their explanations make a lot of sense. I kind of want to save that for the end of the video. Right now, I want to talk about some other encounters that are attributed to the Rocky Mountain hyena. Like many other cryptids in North America, the Rocky Mountain hyena actually got its start with Native American folklore, and I was actually able to find a source that talked about a Native American encounter with the Shunaca Warkanin. The story begins with a tribe noticing that most of its dogs are actually going missing. Everyone is upset, and a whole bunch of young men get together to hunt down whatever is happening with their dogs. They originally think that it is a person, an enemy taking their dogs, not a creature, like they will soon find out. So they hide out in the middle of the night and eventually find this creature, the Shunaca Warkanin, coming in to their camp. And of course, they ambush it just as if it was a normal person. But this is the craziest part. It makes a noise as if it was a human. So a like human-like screaming, which I think tends to be a scary trope with these mythological legends, is just animals making human noises. This also happened in the cow mutilations video. They attacked a creature, and then all of a sudden it sounds like Jerry across the street is dying. Something weird's going on. I also think it's kind of interesting to point out that the Shunaca Warkanin legend is also equated to a big wolf / maybe even a werewolf, so this creature making a man-like scream is a little bit odd and kind of points to those as well. They were able to attack and wound this creature, but it took them a whole day and a half to track it down and eventually catch up to the Shunachawarkaneen where it died. After killing this mythical creature and hearing the human-like screams that it emitted, and with how hard it was to kill, the young men decided that it must be a creature of great power. Because of this, they decided to use it in battle. They skinned it, they painted the hide, and they kept it and used it to give them the same strength that it showed while they were hunting it down to kill it. Apparently, they kept it in what this article describes as a war bundle, which just has a whole bunch of items that men could wear into battle that will give them certain strength, this one apparently giving them endurance. But before it was put in that war bundle, they celebrated killing the beast by holding a big dance. After they put this item in their war bundle, the party actually had a lot of success, killing many enemies and not losing their next crusade. And there you have the Native American perspective on the Shunachawarkaneen, an encounter that they had where they had to hunt one down and kill it, and it showed great endurance and wasn't easily taken down, eventually being turned into an item of great power that they used to their advantage in their fights and in their conflicts. The article that I found this piece of information on actually had a lot of text and some really good stories about Shunachawarkaneen encounters. It was just a little bit too much to go into other than this Native American story. I think we should probably end the video by talking about what I think the creature that has been taxidermied and is now in Ennis, Montana actually is. Like any other of my videos, what made it possible was me sitting down, doing research, combining other sources. I kind of have it in my head of what I think the actual taxidermied creature is that Israel Hutchins shot and is now on display. It's important to say that the museum apparently has been offered to DNA test the creature and they have decided not to. Kind of similarly in my head, it's like when the creature went missing in the 80s. It's probably better to keep the mystery alive than to just, in modern day technology, just explain away something like, oh, yep, that's actually just this kind of dog. That's super lame, and I think to keep the mystery and the history of this creature connected, it's almost better to not know. So we kind of will never know what it actually is, but I kind of like that. One of the suggestions of what this creature could be is that it's just a really bad taxidermy job. It's a really old mount made by a guy that apparently had a whole bunch of different passions, as he was a historian and a grocery store owner and just described as a businessman in this article. Who's to say that he was actually that great of a taxidermist? It's also said that it could have literally just been a dog or a coyote that was just like forced to fit into this mold that he had, and he just didn't really do a great job. Also, if you really know a lot about taxidermy, you might have just realized I don't know a lot about taxidermy, so forgive me. Another option is that this is like some kind of half-breed between a wolf and a dog, something that I think is more likely, and it was kind of built off an idea that I heard in this YouTube video that I'm going to link in the description, that it could actually be a half-breed between a coyote and a wolf, or a coyote and a dog. And the reason why this might be a more specific answer is because those are kind of rare. I've never even heard of it, but then if you actually look up online, which the YouTube video pointed out, if you look up coyote crossbreed, that you'll actually find something that kind of fits the description and looks a little bit like the stuffed mount that is on display in Ennis right now. So instead of it being this crazy mythical creature that is hyena-like, or it's a prehistoric Northern American hyena that is like stalking in the woods nowadays, it's actually a rare crossbreed between coyote and another canine. And I think that makes the most sense, plus the fact that it might not be the best taxidermy job, and that's what's actually going on with in this story. When it comes to I haven't had to say it in a little bit. Give me a second. I have it pulled up.
Shunkawirican.
Do I think that all Shunkawiricans are actually just these coyote hybrids? I don't know. I think that's kind of a lame explanation for the whole mystery aspect of everything combined. But in terms of this one mount that we're not DNA testing, even though we could, we're kind of skeptical as what it is. It probably was this coyote hybrid. Another aspect that I think is cool about the coyote hybrid theory is the fact that a coyote hybrid I had never heard of before until making this video and doing research for it. So it is kind of a mythical creature, especially if you take yourself back 100+ years ago, where people know even less and there's not an online forum or Google image search for you to find out what a creature is. Like today, we know that it's a coyote hybrid, but back in the day, we would have no idea, especially with it being kind of a more rare thing to encounter. So it would have this air of like mystery and what is this creature? What is this beast? So I think that still holds true to the concept of a cryptid unknown creature. Just obviously now, in hindsight, we can see that it was probably just a coyote hybrid.
And now is the part of the video where I have to throw it to you guys in the comment section. What do you think is going on with the Rocky Mountain hyena? Is there really some prehistoric hyenas roaming around the hills in Montana? Or more likely, is it some kind of coy dog that is a rare encounter but still looks just odd enough to throw people into the cryptid conversation? Personally, I really enjoyed the story of the man shooting his own cow in attempts to kill this wild animal to sell it to a businessman who brought it to Idaho, only for it to be brought back up generations later by Jack Kirby, the grandson of the original man that shot it, only for him to take the stuffed cryptid thing to his grandpa's grave so they could smoke one more cig before they left, I guess. And then also the Native American origin of like their story of killing this beast that just wouldn't die and then using it to give them strength and battle themselves. All very fascinating, and I really enjoyed making this video.
Hey guys, welcome to a very special episode of Montana After Midnight. Today we're going to be talking about the Flathead Lake Monster. I've spent the last 5 summers working seasonally on the Flathead Lake, and I've heard many tall tales about this supposed creature or cryptid, and I'm ready to just jump into the history, the Native American legends, and all of the supposed sightings of the Flathead Lake Monster. Some backstory behind the Flathead Lake: it is the largest natural freshwater lake this side of the Mississippi River. It is also a huge tourist attraction during the summer nowadays. Back in the day, there used to be a bustling logging community that would feed into the lake, which led a lot of logs to be left over sitting at the bottom of the lake or floating on top of it to this day. A lot of people will claim that these logs are what people are actually seeing when they see the Flathead Lake Monster, and people often will say that they thought they saw a log and then it started moving like a serpent or a big fish, sometimes even a whale, claiming that they thought it was a log and then it turned out to actually be the monster. Let's start by talking about the Native American legend. The Kootenai tribe apparently used to live near the Flathead Lake, and one winter when the lake was frozen over, 2 girls were crossing the ice when they ran into a pair of antlers sticking straight up out of it. Thinking that this was just a normal deceased animal that was frozen in the water, they went over to collect the antlers to take back to their tribe. When they were messing with the antlers, all of a sudden something sprang to life from underneath the ice, scaring the 2 girls. According to the legend, they were able to transform and get away from this monster. However, things were not all great, as half of the Kootenai tribe apparently drowned and died due to this ice breaking and the monster being released. While the origin date of this legend is unknown, it is considered the oldest tale that relates to a monster within the Flathead Lake. There are 2 really interesting things about this account of the Flathead Lake Monster. Number 1, this is the only story that I heard where someone was actually hurt. Half of the tribe apparently perished due to the Flathead Monster throwing a fit and breaking through the ice. The other thing that's interesting is this is the only account of the Flathead Monster having antlers. Also, how do you like my amazing picture? But this is literally the only story that involves the Flathead Lake Monster having antlers. Every other description of the monster describes it as either whale-like, fish-like, or serpent-like. So I think that's something kind of interesting and unique to this Native American legend, and probably shows a divide between the Native American legend and then the modern sightings and the modern legend that lives on to this day. The first official recorded sighting of what we now see as the modern Flathead Lake Monster was recorded in 1889. This was the same year that Montana became a state. This sighting occurred on a ferry boat called the U.S. Grant, captained by James C. Kerr. This boat carried about 100 passengers from Polson to the north end of the lake, and halfway through their journey, apparently they saw a large, about 20-foot whale-like creature come up right next to the boat. One of the more unruly guests on the boat decided to take aim and shoot at this whale creature, which eventually submerged itself back into the water. This sighting was taken very seriously at the time and is the biggest sighting of a Flathead Lake monster. Typically, the sightings are around 12 to 20 feet, but this one had so many viewers and people recorded it to be a whale-like being. Being makes it sound like extraterrestrial, but actually it was just, a whale-like big fish in a lake. But yeah, people were freaked out about this. One article that I read researching this that brought up this voyage was saying that the boat recently installed a liquor bar, which could have contributed people seeing this creature in the water. Get a little hammered, all of a sudden logs turn into whales, and you got to shoot at it. But that was just the one article that I read. The other sources don't seem to mention that at all, so take that with a grain of salt. The next account of the Flathead Monster that I could find actually was reported in 1950, but supposedly occurred in 1900. 3 fishermen were out in a shallow bay when they stumbled across a 12-foot log hanging out in the water. One of them decided to poke it with one of their spears, and it quickly swam away as fast as it could. This was the first time ever that someone that saw the Flathead Monster related it to a sturgeon, which is a prehistoric lake fish that can grow up to like 20 feet in the wild. This is the type of crazy fish that would be featured on river monsters. Like I said, this is the first time someone related it to a sturgeon, but it will not be the last, because also around the 1950s, there was a big fishing competition for someone to catch a monster fish in the lake. This was the only time a large sturgeon was actually caught in the lake, and the sturgeon is now hanging up in the Polson Museum about 30 minutes south of where I'm sitting right now. Now, if a sturgeon was caught at about 8 feet, why are people still talking about a Flathead Monster? It's pretty clear that it is just the sturgeon in the lake that are growing pretty big. Well, here's the issue. Sturgeon aren't found in Flathead Lake, at least not naturally. According to one old-timer that I was able to talk to about the myth of the Flathead Lake Monster, apparently he believes that this was actually faked. Someone brought in the fish from another site to catch it and win this fishing competition, basically showing it off as a spectacle, a big show, not an actual legitimate catch within Flathead Lake. People have brought up this sturgeon being the Flathead Lake Monster so much that even scientists have kind of throw their hat in the ring, and they have said that sturgeon have no way of accessing the lake. It is physically impossible for them to actually get in the lake naturally. So historically, if sturgeon were caught in the lake, most likely someone was feeding them into the lake and staging their big catch. I find it very interesting that a story from 1900 that was told in the 1950s brings up a sturgeon, and then later in that same decade, a sturgeon is caught in the lake under very fishy means. There is actually a third supposed sighting of the Flathead Lake Monster in the 1950s. This time, a woman named Mrs. Robert Olson saw something moving in the water, originally moving east to west, and then switching from north to south, and then back to east to west again. This supposedly rules out the explanation of it just being a log floating in the water, as it was intentionally changing its direction and moving of its own free will. This conveniently rules out the two most common explanations as to what people are seeing with the Flathead Monster, with most people dismissing it as either a trick of the waves or a log floating in the water. Quick announcement, guys. I've been working on some merch for this channel, mainly because I wanted to design something cool for me to rep, but then I'm also going to make it available to you guys. It is the first drop related to Montana After Midnight, and I've actually had to go through 3 different t-shirt companies. The first one, I ordered samples, and I think I got scammed, straight up robbed. But I made another account with another website, and it turns out I couldn't actually set up a store, so I had to make a third website. So this third website, I'm getting samples right now, and I should have them in about 2 weeks. And once I have them, once I know that they look good, I'll make them available to you, and hopefully you guys can wear them if you want to. Yeah, that's the announcement. Love ya. When doing research for this video on YouTube, the 2 first search results that I found were covering the same 2005 eyewitness testimony of someone seeing the Flathead Lake Monster. It was actually a couple that took their boat out from Polson to wade in a bay, just relaxing, enjoying their afternoon. Eventually, when it was time to go, they went to turn over their boat only to find that their battery had died. So they called a close family member, and while they were waiting for their family member to pick them up, they saw a creature poke its head out of the water, and apparently, like the Loch Ness Monster, they saw rolls of this creature, being the most serpentine description that we've seen so far of the Flathead Lake Monster. Now, this creature was poking out of the water while they were sitting there helpless in their boat when their friends turned the corner. And as their friends were turning the corner, the couple was waving to them, pointing out the monster, only for it to slither down into the depths, and their friends were not able to see the monster that they saw. This, of course, led their friends to think that they were crazy and didn't believe that they actually saw the Flathead Monster. What's interesting is that not only did a monster documentary show do a dramatic reenactment of this for me on YouTube, you can look it up yourself if you look up Flathead Lake Monster, but also a news broadcast in the area picked it up and interviewed this couple about their experience with the Flathead Monster. While super interesting, this is the only example that I found of the Flathead Monster being so close to the Loch Ness Monster, with humps coming out of the water as it slithers back in as it's trying not to be seen. Now, there's also this story from 2017, which I find to be the most ridiculous and just silly. You'll understand why when I tell it. But supposedly in 2017, a woman lost track of her child and heard it crying by the water. As she raced down to the water, eventually she got there only to find her 3-year-old sitting by the shore, totally fine. And when she asked what happened and why the child is okay, supposedly it was carried to shore from being lost in the water by the Flathead Lake Monster. Now, obviously, this is the most fantastical story that we've heard. The Flathead Monster actually saved the child's life by swimming underneath it and carrying it to shore. What a fantastic creature that we are so lucky to share the waters with. In all seriousness, I think it's obviously just either made up or the kid's imagination got the better of it. Either way, I don't think the Flathead Monster saved this kid's life. All that being said, I think now is a perfect time to talk about how some people will write off the sightings of a Flathead Lake Monster for just being an illusion. Most people will say that it is either a log floating in the water that people saw just right that looks like a creature, or it could even be a deceptive wave that has traveled from miles across the lake only to trick people into thinking it's a creature when in reality it is just an abnormal wave. There's actually a sighting in 2020 that actually illustrates a case of mistaken identity out on the water. So a young man was paddleboarding near Summers, Montana, which is the north side of the Flathead Lake, where just a little bit out from him in the shallows, he saw a creature standing up out of the water. From the distance that he was at, he thought it was a grizzly bear standing up in the water, and as he got closer and closer, he was more worried, thinking that this was the largest grizzly bear that he has ever seen. Now, as this thing was rising out of the water and he was slowly getting closer, he soon realized that what he was looking at was far worse. It was a Douglas fir. Apparently, it had gotten caught perfectly in the current and then hitting the bottom of the shallow to stand right up for a perfect split second, a tree standing upright in the water, tricking this man into thinking that he was seeing a grizzly bear slowly rise up out of the water. Really, it was just a harmless tree. But this story illustrates how you can see something at a distance in the water and your mind can trick you into seeing something completely different. which is why a lot of people do not believe the stories behind the Flathead Lake Monster. Now, whether the Flathead Lake Monster is a giant fish, a prehistoric animal, or literally just a trick of the mind and a floating log, one thing remains the same. People still believe that they are seeing something out on the waters. Personally, I love the idea of the Flathead Lake Monster being a mascot, a symbol of the lake, and I do personally really love this drawing that I made, combining every single different piece of lore about the Flathead Lake Monster. In reality, what I really like about this story is the twists and turns and how every single generation seems to have a different myth or legend behind the Flathead Lake Monster. Back in the day, it used to be a Native American tale of a fish with horns that tore apart a tribe, ripping it in half, killing half of its members. And then it evolved into this whale-like creature in 1889, only to then be transformed into a large fishing hoax where a massive prehistoric-looking sturgeon was brought into the lake and was claimed to be the Flathead Lake Monster. Nowadays, with the myths growing even bigger and talk of the Loch Ness Monster, it seems like the Flathead Lake Monster has transformed into something similar to that. This episode involves a murder, prostitution, and a haunting from a lover scorned. Today's episode is going to be on the Dumas Hotel, which is in Butte, Montana, which was open from 1890 to 1982. Being a brothel, there were a lot of less than savory activities happening at this place, and it was connected to the red light district in Butte, which is infamous for crime, which led to a lot of unsettled spirits. With it being running from 1890 to 1982, it is the longest running brothel in the United States and was operating as a hotel after brothels became illegal in Montana, although it got shut down because it wasn't really on the up and up like it would want you to believe. The Dumas Brothel was built by the Nadeau brothers, Joseph and Arthur, and they went with the name Dumas because it was Joseph's wife's maiden name, which is very interesting if you ask me, maybe a little disturbing to name a brothel after your wife, but hey, it was a different time. Now, the upstairs of the brothel was a place of elegance where lots of prestigious people would come to stay, and a lot of their nicer ladies would work. However, the downstairs was not so nice. It was actually a place known for hardship, struggle, and supposed hauntings that come on later in this episode. This downstairs or basement was known to house cribs in which the prostitutes would do their work. There was a whole bunch of illegal activity that was connected to this basement, as well, having a door that went right into a back alley that connected to Butte's red light district, where crimes such as stabbings, shootings, robberies, and more are said to have been committed. One of the most crazy accusations about these cribs is that they housed illegal abortions, which of course would lead to a lot of negative energy down there, and just the fact that anything happening in a basement is 10 times more creepy. There's clearly a lot of suffering going on in this section of the brothel and this area of Butte. Going along with all that crime and the connection to the red light district, and of course the facilities being used, there is said that there is a oppressive male presence that is known to be in this basement of the brothel, people going down there and feeling it, watching them. And of course the speculation is that this is one upset gentleman that used to use these services or died outside of the brothel. The most famous story of death and then a haunting in the brothel comes from a madam that used to run it, and a madam is like a manager but also still a prostitute. This prostitute or madam's name was Eleanor Knott, and she had a plan to run away with her secret lover who was going to leave his wife to be with her. Unfortunately, even though she packed a bag and was ready to run away with him in the middle of the night, she was found the next day in her bed, deceased. Now, the death was ruled of natural causes, but thoughts of a suicide or a murder lingered throughout the brothel. One thing I found interesting is doing research into this. It said natural causes, but then natural causes of excessive drug and alcohol use. So that's not exactly natural, is it? But it is interesting that she clearly died scorned, unhappy, and with a lot of regret. Since then, reports of a woman carrying a suitcase wandering the halls, especially in the 1970s, were brought up by employees who swear no one else could be in there whatsoever. Completely empty building, no one else is there, and yet they see a woman carrying a suitcase only to vanish when they try to track her down. And of course, this goes back to Eleanor and her never-to-happen retreat with her lover that never showed up. There's one more extremely creepy thing that might be involved with Eleanor Knott, but we're going to get to that after we cover the final madam of the Dumas Brothel. Her name was Ruby Garrett, and before she became the madam of the brothel, she actually was arrested and put in prison for 9 months for shooting her abusive husband in a bar in Butte, which I just think is a very fun fact. I don't know, it doesn't really relate to the hauntings, but she killed her husband. With Ruby Garrett being the last madam of the brothel, I think it's interesting that it ended kind of the way that it lived, with a crime. She was actually robbed and pistol whipped, which led to an investigation by the IRS, which found them guilty of tax fraud and ended up being the reason why the brothel got shut down. Now the person that robbed her was arrested, but of course did way more harm than good because it got the whole business shut down, which is just kind of perfect. Going back to the red light district and all the crimes that were committed outside and all the crimes that were committed inside the brothel itself. Now let's go back to Eleanor Knott and the last creepy thing that I said happened here at the brothel. Legend has it that one of the guests that stayed at the brothel in one of the upstairs apartments after Eleanor Knott's death was compelled to paint the face of a woman over and over again, a woman they've never seen before. Now this painter would paint canvas after canvas, throwing all of them away, never satisfied, feeling very discontent with these paintings. One of the paintings was rescued and taken out and is believed to be Eleanor Knott because her spirit is still there, upset, unhappy with the way that she left this world. Today, the brothel is now a museum centered in Butte, still known for its creepy paranormal occurrences. My favorite part of this story is all the crimes centered around the brothel and its connection to the red light district, even having one of its madams be arrested for the murder of her husband, and especially the mystery of Eleanor Knott. Did she die of natural causes from sorrow and drinking too much? Or did she die of murder and poison? All we know is that her alleged spirit is still there to this day, even beckoning people to paint her face. I knew I wanted to do a ghost town for this episode, but I didn't know which one to go after, so I actually looked up a list of ghost towns in Montana, and I got a list of like 13. And from another Google search, I found out that there's over 100 ghost towns in Montana. When I saw the original list of 13 ghost towns, I read through all of them, and half of them, I swear, weren't even like true ghost towns to me. And by that I mean very touristy, almost even still running, which after talking to the visiting center lady at the Garnet Ghost Town, I found out that that's actually a pretty common thing. With that list of 13 ghost towns, the one that I found most fascinating, I even marked it as like number 1 or number 2 for ones I wanted to cover, was the Garnet Ghost Town. So that just worked out really well because the Garnet Ghost Town is only an hour from where I live. Right now I live in Missoula, so the Garnet Ghost Town was basically in my backyard, so why not go out there and check it out. I do have to give credit to my mom because I told her I was doing this project and she told me, gotta get really into it, and she was right. I'm very glad that I went. So throughout this story, you're gonna see a lot of B-roll of the Garnet Ghost Town itself, as I go over the history, some deep information, and some personal stories that were told to me from the visiting center worker. And then I'm also gonna take you through my journey of walking through the ghost town, and at the very end, I'm gonna talk about some of the more haunted elements of the ghost town because I find that kind of interesting, although it's not necessarily the point of this specific video. The history of the town actually dates back to the 1860s, where miners were first seen actually using the Garnet area. The town of Garnet actually started in 1895, which was a couple years later, of course. The town gets its name from the semi-precious garnet rock, which I didn't know was a type of rock that existed, but hey, I'm not a geologist. My journey through the ghost town, which I would assume is just the typical journey of someone visiting the ghost town, at least during the summer, because during the winter they do some pretty crazy stuff that I'll talk about later. You drive for about 30 minutes out of Missoula, and then for another 30 minutes up a dirt road, basically up the mountain, which is pretty crazy that the Garnet Ghost Town is like up the mountain and so secluded. I feel like it's literally half the journey. Just like putting yourself in the time frame of when this town would be active, being up a mountain and 30 minutes out from the nearest big town. And I'm talking about from like modern car. And this ghost town, as we'll find out later, was in full swing from about like the 1800s through the mid 1900s. So not as good of transportation as we have nowadays. Anyway, so as you're driving up the mountain, once you're about 10 minutes out from the actual ghost town, you're going to find this fire watch tower. It's more of just a cabin that's honestly in still pretty good condition, but right next to it is another cabin that's less so in good condition. It's missing its whole like top half, and now there's a fire pit in the middle, which I'm sure isn't supposed to be there. And there's a sign that says to respect the history and not mess with anything. Overall, it was just a good first impression of what you're gonna get. You get one building that isn't standing anymore, it's missing its whole top half, and then you get another building that's like perfectly intact. From there, we drove, like I said, about another 10 minutes, and we get to the parking lot of the Garnet Ghost Town. And one thing I noticed about it was that there's actually campsites right next to the parking lot. So you could technically pay to camp right next to the ghost town. It's probably about like a minute walk, and it is decently outside of the ghost town, but you're basically right there. Speaking of which, I did have to pay to go visit the ghost town. It's $10 per person if you're over 12, I think. So me and my brother together, who, shout out my brother, who helped me like film and just was there with me. It was a fun activity. Why not bring the little bro around? It was $20 to go visit the ghost town. We were probably there for an hour and a half. Now, I would say like 99% of the ghost towns in Montana are actually mining towns. Montana was a big mining state back in the day, which I'm actually originally from Illinois, so I'm not like super up to date with my Montana history, so this is an awesome experience for me. And part of the reason why I like making these videos is I got to find out that, hey, mining was super, super important. And not only was mining important, but different types of mining was in at different time periods, which caused a lot of these ghost towns to go in and out of fashion. And the Garnet Ghost Town in the parking lot has a pretty nifty mining cart right out front. That was basically the first sign of this town's existence outside of the fire watch tower that's about 10 minutes down the road. In total, there was about 50 mines in the area, and like I said, they were first used in about 1860, which predates the town itself. In 1898, there was an abundance of gold found at the Nancy Hanks mine, and the Nancy Hanks mine became the most profitable mine in the area, containing 3 veins of precious material. And it's actually that mine in 1898 that turned the town of Garnet into a boom town. And with that boom, the town hosted a total of 1,000 people. During its lower periods, when mining wasn't as active, it would get down to around like 100. From the parking lot, there's a little path that will take you probably, like I said, about a minute to get to the actual ghost town. But on your way down, since you're at a higher elevation, you get to look down at the ghost town as it is in full force. Now, the ghost town is actually pretty well maintained. It looks really intact. Most of the buildings are still standing. And there's a very specific reason for this, and that's because the ghost town burned down and then was rebuilt later. And as we'll get into when we're talking more about the history, there was quite a bit more to the town before it all turned to ash. As you're in the ghost town, you're going to find yourself in this downtown Main Street type area with a whole bunch of buildings. First one that I came across was private, and I'm guessing is a wintertime cabin that they rent out to people, which sounds incredibly scary. Imagine being by yourself up this mountain, only accessible by snowmobile. Yeah, you can stay in a cabin. Sounds like a blast to me. I'm sure that's when the actual like paranormal haunted stuff really occurs. You know what I'm saying? That's when I'd be pretty scared. But that's the first thing that I see is a cabin that says private. To the left, there's the saloon, hotel, and all the way down is the visiting center. If I was going to categorize the trip in terms of things being interesting, the saloon was very interesting because that's where a lot of the historically significant things happened, at least in terms of stories that I heard, and then also just lore with the background of the ghost town. In terms of the most paranormal thing that happens at the ghost town is the saloon. You can actually hear people being jolly, having a good time still in the dead of winter when no one's there, playing the piano. That's part of the haunted nature of the ghost town that exists. And honestly, that's pretty interesting. There's also peeling walls that show newspapers from back in the day, which is super fascinating. And little side tangent, I actually did some demo work at a dude ranch that I used to work for, and we tore down a wall and we found newspapers from back in the day when that building was built. It's just really cool that in the old times, as insulation and wall stuffing, they would use newspapers. So when things kind of fall apart, you go back and you can see the newspapers of the time. And there's some pretty good shots we got of that in the saloon. In terms of where I got more information, there's signs all over the ghost town that gives you little tidbits, specific things about certain characters that played along in the ghost town. And then also, I got a really good interview, you could call it. It was more of a conversation I had with the visiting center lady. Her name was Nina. She was super helpful. So if you ever go to the ghost town, make sure you're really nice to Nina if you run into her. She showed us these pictures. She talked once again about the fire that burnt down the town. The town actually was revived a little bit. That's why the buildings are in such good conditions. The town was starting to be revived in the 1970s, which is a while ago, but in terms of like a ghost town, not that long ago. Some of the buildings that were given a helping hand and slightly rebuilt were the ones that you can go and see nowadays, which would be the J.R. Wells Hotel, Dale's Saloon, Kelly's Bar, and the F.A. Davies store. She also told me a story about how one day a visitor came in, a girl in her 80s showed up to the ghost town and said, "You're not going to believe this, but that building right there, I was born in 80 years ago," which is absolutely wild. Not born in a hospital. She was actually born in the saloon that me and my brother just were in, which is just crazy. You know, this lady has to be built tough. Is she born in a saloon? Are you kidding me? She also talked to us about the shop owner, which we go into later, who ended up being the last resident of the ghost town. Because a ghost town, how it works, how it's formed, is the original residents that used to live there. As soon as the last one is gone, either leaves or dies, it becomes a ghost town. By 1940, most of the people had moved away, although F.A. Davie was still running the store and the hotel remained operable. The Nancy Hanks mine was used on and off up until about 1954. By the 1960s, the mines were deemed unprofitable. In terms of interesting story, I would say the saloon has more, but the hotel is definitely a little bit eerier and creepier because you have all these bedrooms with bed frames that are falling apart, walls that are peeling, stained walls, and it's a building that's made to house people that are no longer there, which ties into what makes ghost towns kind of creepy in the first place. Because the people that would come there to mine gold, silver, you name it, would need a place to stay, so they would stay in the hotel. And there would be private rooms, and then at the very, very top, there was just this open area that would house a lot of men in bunk beds. Overall, this was definitely the most eerie place to be inside of the ghost town, just because of how lived in it was, how crammed it was, and all the decaying furniture, which you didn't really see in the saloon, despite having more stories about it. The only paranormal story I've heard about the hotel is that you can see a man look out the window, which I think is just classic for anything that's supposed to be haunted, is you just say that there's a man that looks out the window. So do as you will with that one. Not as interesting as the saloon, in my opinion. Another thing I want to say about the ghost town buildings in general is no matter which building I went into, they were significantly colder than it was outside. It was a pretty decently hot day. Let's say it was about 80 degrees. Inside the building would feel 60, actually a noticeable difference in temperature, which is a little eerie, but I think more just has to say about how well built these buildings were. Like, they kept out the heat that well. That's pretty incredible. The last, like, main focus building in the ghost town would be the mercantile or shop, which would have been the one-stop shop for anything and everything people would need in the town. And there was a lot of, like, rundown shoes, toys, wheels, anything of that nature. Basically, all the random trinkets that survived the ghost town, they kind of put in the shop. And I think if the notion of a once well-lived-in place being abandoned, being kind of creepy, I think that's what's going to really, like, get to you, because there's just all this stuff that used to be important to people that now is just decayed and all brown and kind of just old and deteriorating. Also, in the back of the shop, there was a room with a dirt floor and then a chute, which I would imagine is how they would do deliveries, kind of like a stocking room. And that would be the room where if you're gonna do some like crazy, I don't know, Ouija board type stuff, like that would be it. It was dark in there. Dirt floor was kind of spooky. And then also, like I said, with all the buildings being a little bit colder than outside, that room itself was like even more so, like 10 more degrees cooler. Now, the downtown itself was a couple of buildings and they were all standing pretty well, but before the fire, there was a number, like, instead of having one saloon, there was actually like 5 saloons in the town. So it used to be much bigger before this fire. And if you keep walking and you go behind the hotel, there's a whole bunch of little paths that lead you to individual cabins. And there's probably about like 10 to 15 scattered cabins, which would be like individual houses that people would live in of varying degrees of like stability. Some of them being like shacks that are tilted on their side and falling apart, like you could touch it and it would fall over, and others like completely standing, just dirt floor and nothing really in there. As you're walking down this trail, you'd also see like rusted tins and just random metal materials that have survived over time that have just been left there to rot and decay. The ghost town itself is kind of just one big loop. It kind of takes you around into the town all the way over to see all the cabins, and then you kind of circle back, and right around here is another guest cabin that you could rent and stay in overnight. Now let's focus on the haunted element of the Garnet Ghost Town. I alluded to this a little bit earlier in the video, talking about how you can stay the winter and about how people have heard jolly musical noises coming from Kelly's saloon. A guy named Michael was actually stationed at Garnet Ghost Town to stay in one of the cabins over the winter. Everything is snowed in and you have to be feeling quite isolated at this moment. Like I said earlier in the video, the only access to the ghost town is actually by snowmobile. While he was staying in the ghost town all alone, basically his biggest worry was to keep himself warm with placing firewood in a burning furnace. One day, out of the blue, he starts hearing music coming from the saloon. This, of course, freaked him out, as everything is snowed in around him, there's no footsteps on the ground, and he's supposed to be all alone, yet he's hearing music coming from a building that's supposed to be empty. He decided to walk around the saloon to an access point where he could go inside the building. From there, he inches towards the opening, but decides against going in, probably fearing that something really weird's going on, because of course something weird's going on. After a little bit of time, curiosity gets the best of him. He's still hearing this music. He decides he has to go into the saloon and figure out what the heck is going on. He creeps around the building, finds that opening again, and crawls through. The part of the saloon that he gets in was actually made up to be a bedroom or a living room, so he had to go through there to the actual main saloon part of the building. Once he gets closer towards that piano area where everyone would congregate, where the music is coming from, the music stops, and it goes dead silent. Mike then leaves the saloon, going back to his cabin, supposedly not hearing any more music from there on out, and wondering if he just kind of thought the whole thing up, or if something more mysterious was going on. Ultimately, in terms of like ghost story, I think this one's pretty good, because hearing music is a little bit further than just hearing like a creaky floorboard, but then it's also not so outside the realm of possibility where you're just like, oh, I don't believe this. Like, I could totally see someone being alone in a ghost town, hearing music, or thinking that they hear music. So overall, I think it's a pretty tame, pretty good ghost story for the town. And ultimately, like I've kind of said throughout the rest of this video, Garnet Ghost Town is more about the historic significance to Montana, more so than it being an attraction of paranormal stuff. Who knows, maybe one day we'll do it after this project takes off and we have 1 million subscribers. We'll just have to stay the night during the dead of winter after taking a snowmobile all the way up the hill by ourselves. Sounds like a blast. In terms of my specific trip, that is basically the gist of it. We went and did a lap all around the ghost town. We went to the visitor center to get more information. We got a pamphlet that gave us some more history. And then we also checked out the decaying buildings and cabins in the area. It's a really nifty little town. It's very interesting seeing how well the buildings actually stood up, juxtaposed to some buildings that did not stand the test of time and are like on their side or missing 90% of the materials that were made to use them. The reused to make them. But overall, it was a really fun trip, and if you're in the Missoula area or Bonner area, I definitely recommend just looking up the Garnet Ghost Town, where you'll get some Apple or Google Maps that'll take you straight there. And like I said, it's a $10 fee. You just put it in a pink slip, drop it off, and you get to enjoy the ghost town.
20 minutes outside of Yellowstone, one of the most unusual and bizarre deaths occurred right on the Montana and Idaho border. But before we go into this sudden and ironic death, we need to go into the legendary and historic life of Richard W. Rock, otherwise known as Rocky Mountain Dick. That's what they really called him back in the day. Also, this might be a good time to just throw it out there. When I looked up images of Rocky Mountain Dick, you would be amazed with what I saw. The first couple results were, of course, of Richard here, but then a lot of the other results were just rocks that ended up looking like, I'm assuming you can guess. Rock was born in the eastern side of the United States, most likely New York or Philadelphia, sometime in the 1850s. Like a lot of men in this era, eventually, as he reached adulthood, he decided to go west and ended up in the Dakota, Montana, Wyoming, Idaho area of the West. He fell in love with the region and eventually settled near Henry's Lake, which is right outside of Yellowstone National Park. There are some accounts of Rocky working as an Army Scout, although he personally denies that he ever worked any position in the government, including the Army, as a scout. During the summers, Rock would build up his ranch, and in the meantime, he would work as a guide and a buffalo skinner, which eventually got him the name of Rocky Mountain Dick, because he was doing all these guides in the Rocky Mountains. On his ranch, Rock would capture a variety of astonishing animals. He would not only capture them, but some of them he would keep on his ranch in acres and acres of property. Those animals included buffalo, deer, moose, bear, mountain goats, and most importantly, elk. Over time, he began transporting and selling these animals to different zoos and wildlife parks across the United States, which made him a decent living. What's really crazy is his methods for capturing them. I was able to find two distinct methods. One method would involve trapping them, and he used this on elk, deer, moose, things like that. And what would happen is during high winter times when there is a lot of snowfall and vegetation is hard to come by, he would set bait in these huge corrals about 12 feet high, and the animals would just wander in there, and they get in there easily, but then they can't get back out. Just a simple trap to catch some of these animals. One of his more elaborate methods for catching things like elk involved a lasso, a pair of skis, and some dogs. This would occur again in the middle of the winter, and he would use his skis to glide across the snow and his dogs to pull him, where elk would sink pretty far down into the snow. And once he was close enough, he would lasso the animal and then secure it to an 8-foot sled fitted with runners that the dogs would then haul all the way back to his ranch. Now, obviously, that second method is way more involved, and I almost want to see a video of how someone can even do that. I could see maybe using the dogs and the skis for him to lasso an elk,
In fact, I've actually seen people lasso elk before. I can't imagine getting that elk on any kind of structure on skis to then get it to his ranch, but apparently that's how he did it. Being a mountain man back in the day gets you more than just the nickname. I guess it gets you some pretty incredible skills when it comes to capturing animals. As his operation grew, he would then partner with other mountain men, including fellow hunter and trapper Yellowstone Vic Smith. Although their partnership didn't last, and in 1890 the two went their separate ways, although remaining friends. Before we go any further, I do need to say that I got most of this information from an article on history.net, which was written by David McCormick. Shout out my sources. Obviously, I got to do a lot of reading and research. I also used a website called All About Bison. Both, as always, are going to be linked in the description of this video. Before we go and talk about dangerous and awesome creatures, I think we should talk about some dangerously awesome looking t-shirts and hoodies, which you can get on my store, Montana After Midnight. It's linked below. I got hoodies, I got shirts, we got a whole bunch of different colors, and you can check it out if you want to support the channel and these fun videos that I make. After his dealings with Yellowstone Vic, Rocky decided that he was going to focus on his elk selling operation, and while that was all fine and dandy, logistically it was tough. He had to get all of the elk from his ranch, which sat at the Idaho-Montana border, all the way up to Bozeman, Montana. From there, the elk could take a train to wherever they needed to go to. Unfortunately, the wagon ride from his ranch to Bozeman was pretty treacherous and exhausting, as he could only take 2 elk at a time, and I'm sure transporting live animals is pretty rough, especially animals that aren't really seen as domesticated. But some way, somehow, Rocky Mountain Dick would take a wagon all the way up to Bozeman, where they were able to get on a train. In one case, after a deal fell through in New York, Rocky decided to just donate the elk to the Brooklyn Zoo for a couple of reasons. One, it's nice, but also it saved him the cost of getting those elk all the way back to his ranch, and it also saved him a trip where he had to haul the elk back down. So all in all, it was kind of a win-win just to donate the elk, but that's the kind of thing that can happen in the elk transporting business. Despite making money off of this, Rock claimed that profit was only secondary to his deep admiration for wildlife, especially the American bison, which he believed had been criminally exterminated. He openly encouraged the US government to create protected buffalo preserves, and also hoped that his herd could help repopulate the species. However, not everyone believed that Rocky Mountain Dick held these conservation views, because during Yellowstone's anti-poaching efforts, some suggested that Dick was illegally hunting and poaching elk and buffalo in Yellowstone National Park. This would mean illegally hunting these animals on Yellowstone territory and then quickly scavenging the bodies to get only the most valuable parts. Dick seemed to have the perfect cover for an operation like this, living super close to Yellowstone and also having his own preserves of these animals, making the perfect cover for him trying to sell valuable elk meat, things like that. That being said, he was never charged, caught, convicted of doing anything illegal at the time, and it simply seemed like he was someone to keep an eye on, or a suspect, which makes perfect sense. He does seem like a good suspect, but that doesn't mean that he was actually doing anything wrong. Rock also captured moose, although these massive creatures proved much more difficult to keep in captivity. One exception was a female moose that he took care of in captivity that actually worked out pretty well. That moose was named after Nellie Bly, which was a famous journalist at the time. She was famous for a couple of different things. The most popular thing she did was she traveled around the world in 72 days, trying to outpace the famous book Around the World in 80 Days, and she successfully did it. She also did some on-the-streets journalism for back in the day, going into mental health institutions, probably referred to as insane asylums at the time, and she was able to prove abuse in there. So she seems like a pretty cool lady, and I highly recommend looking into Nellie Bly. Anyway, Nellie Bly. the moose, became something of a spectacle. Rock used her to pull sleds and compete in races against dogs and even horses. This drew huge crowds and quite the interest. This was up until Rocky Mountain Dick decided it was time to part ways with Nellie Bly, and he sold her at the World's Fair in Chicago in 1893. Shout out Chicago. Bear down. What a season, guys. What a season. If you're wondering why I'm a Bears fan, check out my most recent video. It's a community video where I tell my story a little bit and I read some community tabbed spooky stories. It's a cool video. Check it out after this one. While Rocky Mountain Dick has this amazing story of owning, taming, and racing a moose, the animal most closely tied to his fate is the American bison. As mentioned earlier in the video, Rocky had a vested interest in keeping the American buffalo thriving. Rocky owned several buffalo and kept them in a 10-acre enclosure on his ranch. He successfully bred them and even experimented with crossbreeding, which sent me down a rabbit hole where I learned a little bit more about crossbreeding of buffalo and cattle. And apparently you can get something called a beefalo, which is 3/8 buffalo. I'm really bad at science. I don't know how that happens, but beefalo do exist, and feel free to research the crossbreed between buffalo and certain types of cattle. Very interesting, and I probably will look into it more, just not for this video. It was one of these buffalo, a normal 100% buffalo, named Lindsay, who was 9 years old, that Rocky raised from a calf that would bring everything to an end. On the morning of March 22nd, 1902, Rock was feeding Lindsay. This was a specific bison that he had raised from a calf and had even ridden before. With no warning, and while Rocky's back was turned, Lindsay charged directly at him. Lindsay gored him repeatedly. Rocky's screams drew his wife and a hired hand named Benny Tidcombe. Tidcombe tried to drive the animal off with a pitchfork, but it was no use. Lindsay gored Rock 29 times before a neighbor finally arrived and was able to shoot the buffalo. Rocky Mountain Dick, 55 years old at the time, now laid trampled on the ground with one of his favorite buffalo shot dead near him. Apparently his favorite sombrero, which was iconic with his style, I'm sure I've shown images and I'll show more, lay trampled on the ground next to him. And it wasn't long before he soon joined Lindsay the buffalo and passed on himself. The remaining animals were later purchased by Montana Senator William A. Clark and eventually put on display in Butte. Today, Rocky Mountain Dick is looked at as a larger-than-life character that did seemingly impossible things with wild animals that make the American West what it is today. And with his death, it symbolizes the slow transition into a more modern America and the death of the Wild West frontier. And that's the story of Rocky Mountain Dick. Now, originally, this video was going to be completely different. I started off by looking up strange deaths in Yellowstone National Park, thinking that that would be a great Montana After Midnight video. But, of course, I just kept reading, and eventually I found Rocky Mountain Dick. And I gotta say, the website that I found, historynet.com, which is crazy, historynet.com, but the website that I found told me a very interesting story, and with a little bit of other research and different sources, I'm really happy with telling you guys the legend of Rocky Mountain Dick. Previously, I kind of wanted to talk about Jeremiah Johnson. There's a good chance that I've referenced Jeremiah Johnson in the last 4 videos that I've made. People have talked about him, and there's so much information that I don't want to go that in depth. But then I found Rocky Mountain Dick, and it's kind of served the purpose of talking about a mountain man legend. Now, he technically lived a couple miles outside of Montana in Idaho, so please forgive me. But I definitely enjoyed talking about Rocky Mountain Dick and his exploits. Now, of course, today I think people would have a different view on capturing all these animals and putting them onto your own land. But back in the day, times were different. And honestly, I think it was kind of cool for back in the day. In a way, he is a little bit of a contradiction as someone that fought for bison to not go extinct and be preserved, even talking to the government, pleading with them to do something, which luckily they have, and we have a whole bunch of different buffalo and bison ranges and ranches and stuff like that. But then at the same time, he hunted and used the land for himself, and then also sold a whole bunch of animals across the US and even globally. So this gray area that he lives in, I find really interesting and a total product of the time. I also find it ironic, and I mentioned it earlier in the video, that what he did and what he loved the most in the world ended up killing him. This was Lindsay, a bison that he had raised from a calf that ended up turning on him, proving that some animals aren't meant to be domesticated and played with, like bears in a circus. There's always that chance that at any moment they could turn on you. Probably the coolest thing about this guy was the fact that he owned and tamed a moose, which if you're someone that lives out west, you know that moose are like a little bit rare. Like you gotta at least go deep into a national park. I mean, some areas there's more moose than others, but you know, I've probably seen 3-4 times as many bear out in the wild than I have moose. So the fact that he was able to find, track, capture a moose is pretty insane. And the fact that they're very known for being super aggressive adds a whole nother layer. There's also the consideration that you don't really see moose in any zoos. I haven't heard of a moose preserve, but maybe it's out there. Clearly elk were able to be shipped across the US and put in zoos, but moose, not really. So I think that adds to his accomplishments in the fact that he was able to tame and own a moose.
This video concept started with me wanting to cover some of the most iconic prison break stories that happened in Montana. Through my research, I found things that were akin to a Hollywood production of something like Escape from Alcatraz or The Shawshank Redemption. Although these stories had similar notes, I found it to be much richer as it was based off real Montana history. So, fun fact about Frank Connolly, the first warden of the Montana State Prison, was that he actually wasn't the first warden of that prison. This is possible because Montana State Prison was founded in 1889 after Montana became a state. The prison grounds were there previously, and Frank Connolly was just a guard, not necessarily the warden. Although it was Frank Connolly with his partner Thomas Mateague who stepped up to then run the prison under contract of the state starting in 1889. So by technicality, he was the first warden of the Montana State Prison, even though the prison grounds were there before Montana was actually even considered a state. The partnership that Connolly had with Mateague worked like this. Connolly would handle the day-to-day operations of the prison, being the man on site, aka the warden, where Mateague would handle the finances, doing accounting and getting payments towards the prison, making sure that it ran at a cost-effective rate. With this being such a pivotal time in Montana history, I did a little deep dive into what was going on at the time and what it looked like, what a prisoner of a Montana State Prison would be. And what I found was there was a lot of ranch crimes and gang activity, as well as previously established vigilante law that was common in the state of Montana. So much so that I think I want to cover some of the gang criminal activity that happened in Montana, as well as the vigilantes that went to stop the crime. I think that will be a very interesting topic for another video. But for right now, all you need to know is that in 1864, Montana became a U.S. territory, and in 1883, the North Pacific Railroad brought settlers, supplies, and industry to the territory of Montana, opening it up to trade, commerce, and agriculture. While Montana in the late 1800s was no stranger to violent crimes, slowly the gang activity and the vigilante justice was being replaced with established law enforcement. Like previously mentioned, it is 1889 when Montana first becomes a state, and that's where we find Frank Connolly taking over the Montana State Prison. during this time of transition between the rough old ways of the West and some new law enforcement reform. Frank Connolly was born in Maryland in 1864, and by the age of 1, he already had lost his father. Soon after, he also lost his mother, becoming an early orphan. Things weren't all lost, as he still had his brothers. However, he did have to grow up extremely quick, and his formal schooling ended at the age of 14. It wasn't until 1880, at the age of 16, he followed his brothers out to the wonderful state of Montana. Originally, he started out surveying the Yellowstone area. While being a really cool job, we don't have any specific details of what he did, although we can imagine he was mapping out some terrain and laying down the original foundation and infrastructure of what eventually would become Yellowstone National Park. Speaking of Yellowstone National Park, I recently made a video on the 1959 Yellowstone earthquake, which affected the park greatly, changing some of the geyser eruption timings, as well as creating a new lake. So if you're interested in Yellowstone National Park, I highly recommend checking out that video after this one. After his brief stunt surveying the Yellowstone area, Connolly moved to Miles City. It was there where he signed a vigilante pledge aiming on getting rid of criminals in the area. I found this quote talking about the pledge, and apparently it went, "Select and name such of bad men of our community as shall be dealt with by us, and decide what we shall do with them, whether they shall be doomed to die or otherwise." Connolly rose among the ranks of the vigilantes and was soon known as the Batman of Miles City. Just kidding, that didn't happen, but it would have been cool. However, Connolly did soon become a sheriff deputy in Miles City, working for the police department, hunting down criminals in the area. I couldn't find anything of significance that happened while he was a sheriff deputy in the area, but you can imagine it was ruffians and gangs that had to be dealt with, just general lawlessness on the frontier. It was in 1986 when escorting 2 men to the prison in Deer Lodge, where Connolly decided that his days as a sheriff deputy were over and he was going to transition into being a prison guard. Like I said previously, it was in 1889 when Montana gained its statehood, and while Frank Connolly was a guard previously, he stepped up to become the first warden of the Montana State Prison alongside his partner, Thomas Mateague. Under the contract that they had with the state, they were responsible for housing, feeding, and disciplining the inmates, all while being able to make a profit if they were financially stable. This agreement is what led to his long tenure as the warden of the Montana State Prison, where he became super well known for his controversial but also influential prison reform. When he inherited the prison or signed the contract with the state, he needed to make lots of improvements to the security, as well as just making the buildings more sound. This is going to be a common theme with Connolly. He was constantly trying to build up the prison. Connolly's ambition to build up the prison would not stop for decades, and eventually the state of Montana actually wanted to move the prison from Deer Lodge to Billings, but because of financial trouble, they couldn't do that, and the prison stayed in Deer Lodge, and eventually they supported Connolly improving the facility, something that he's been doing ever since he became the warden. Increasing capacity also kind of increases how much money he can make from taking care of these prisoners. While the state of Montana allowed Frank Connolly to improve the prison, they didn't necessarily give him the funds to do so, and this is where Frank Connolly's most infamous, controversial, and well-known fact of his reform comes from. It was the convict labor. The convicts would actually build up the prison that they were staying in. Connolly was very proud of this, seeing as it was something that led to people making a change and actually reforming from criminal to part of society, and of course it also helped out the prison quite a bit. Everyone in the construction crew that built up the wall and improved the prison at the time was a convict, except for the foreman and the superintendent that handled the construction. Of course, there was some pushback with this from labor unions saying that this was immoral, and other people just not liking that convict labor was being used, but Connolly pushed forward and kept building. He expanded a wall and then built a women's quarters, kitchen, dining hall, and even a theater for the inmates. Makes me think of the Green Mile, which I just watched here in this apartment with a couple of my friends, which is probably one of the saddest movies ever. You've seen the Green Mile, you know what I'm talking about, and if you haven't seen it, You should watch it. Conley would expand his convict labor program to be outside of the prison. Things like highways and state buildings would be built by these convicts. With a lot of these inmates working on crews that worked on buildings outside of the prison was making quite a bit of money, and there was some financial questionable decisions that go down in Conley's legacy, painting not quite the best picture. When you look into Frank Conley, you'll see that he is a very controversial character, and honestly, a lot of the articles that I saw were talking about good things, but I think the financial side and this convict labor is where people get a little shady aspect of what Frank Conley was doing. With the convict labor program, a lot of prisoners were actually able to live off-site, being less heavily guarded and offered reduced prison sentences. So it was a pretty good deal for these guys to start doing a little bit of work and building up these state buildings and highways. And of course, if they messed up, they got into some bad business, they would be sent right behind bars back at the prison, maximum security. Overall, it was this convict labor and the finances gained from it that became Conley's most famous and infamous legacy. Some people praising it, looking at the positives and believing that the work actually helped the inmates, giving the inmates a chance of discipline and earning their keep while also being less confined to the prison walls, while other people look at the finances, think it's a little bit shady, while also thinking it's immoral to put these convicts through labor. What made me think of the Shawshank Redemption was the finance side, because Frank Conley had these questionable finances that people thought were a little bit fraudulent, and that's part of his controversy. And if you've seen the Shawshank Redemption, the main character is doing the warden's finances. So that was the tie in my brain that made me connect the dots there, but I don't know. What do you guys think? I think it's about time we cover the brutal and bloody escape attempt that nearly killed Frank Conley. On March 8, 1908, two inmates, George Rock and W.A. Haynes, launched a violent attack in order to escape and break free from the prison. Rock was incarcerated for murder, while Haynes was there for horse theft. They had two lesser-known accomplices, C.B. Young and Orm Stevens. An important element of this escape attempt is that Haynes was able to get his hands on a guard's pocket knife before they even attempted the escape. Through this, the attempt was way more bloody and violent than it probably would have been if he went in unarmed. The escape started with the four men asking to see Conley during one of his visiting hours. He actually allowed prisoners to come up and air their grievances with him in person. This was made possible because Frank Conley wasn't scared of the inmates. Standing at 6'4" with a pistol on his hip, he wasn't scared of whatever came his way and frequently met with inmates if they wished to speak with him. The assault started by taking out the deputy warden. He was waiting outside of Frank Conley's office and ended up being beat by a horse bridle. If you don't know what a horse bridle is, it's basically the thing that goes around the horse's mouth. It doesn't go into detail how they beat him up with it, but you can imagine that they were hitting him almost in like a whipping fashion that would really hurt with some hard leather and especially the metal pieces. This is a very unique and brutal way for them to attack the guard, but in prison, I'm guessing they had to do whatever they could to get the upper hand to hopefully find freedom for themselves. Haynes then burst into Conley's office, waving the knife that he had stolen, threatening him, demanding to be set free. Conley responded by pulling his pistol and shooting at the inmate, hitting him in his ear. Soon after, Rock rushed into the room, this time with the deputy warden in his hands as a body shield. This didn't deter Warden Conley, as he was still able to get the upper hand and shoot down Rock. Rock was shot in the head and Haynes in the lungs twice, but they still kept going after Conley. Conley unloaded his pistol, shooting every single bullet that he had until all he had to defend himself was a chair and the butt of his pistol, whacking it against the men until help was able to arrive and save his life. When it was all said and done, Conley sustained 50 stab wounds and needed 103 stitches. One wound was so close to his jugular that it's a miracle that he didn't bleed out and die himself. Unfortunately, there was one guard that ended up losing his life in this incident, the same one that was assaulted and used as a body shield. This was Chief Deputy James Robinson, who was brutally mutilated and had his neck slit. Now, while this is the more definitive version of the assault, I was able to find a somewhat different version that still ended up with the same result, but had a slightly different sequence of events, and the positioning of the people was different as well. This alternate version of events had a few key differences that I wanted to highlight, some of them being almost comical and other elements being more sadistic and making the whole scene seem more horrendous. The comical aspect is that instead of Rock rushing into the room after Haynes was shot at, it's Rock and the other two inmates rush into the room, with Connolly shooting at them, chasing them down, almost in this comical, like silent movie fashion. The Three Stooges bust through a door and then they're hunted down by a guy and they're just kind of running in between these two rooms. But what became comical turned sadistic as I later read that he found Rock over the deputy warden, where Connolly then moved Rock, finding the deputy warden had his throat slit. A more horrific scene as he uncovers that his co-worker and probably friend, at least acquaintance, had been brutally murdered. While this scenario is interesting, I don't think it's as credible as the story where Haynes busts into the room and then Rock comes in with the guard, threatening to kill the guard as well. I think that makes more sense, and I found more sources that talked about it that way. While Rock and Haynes were shot, neither men were allowed to die, because Frank Connolly will have his revenge. He nursed both men back to health just so they could be tried and put to death in his prison. In fact, both men were the only two prisoners to ever be hung in Montana State Prison history. Seems like historically the other two lesser known inmates that tried to escape actually had much less to do with the escape attempt and weren't involved in the crazy violence of this crime. One of the other assailants actually got off scot-free with no charges brought up against him, and the other one had years added to his sentence, where Haynes and Rock both were put to death. And this is just one of many incidents that gives Montana State Prison its notorious, infamous, darkly clouded past. It also feeds into the paranormal phenomenon that is found in the Montana State Prison, where it is said that you can hear ghosts slamming doors, speaking in tongues, and wandering the halls. And like I mentioned in the beginning of the video, make sure you subscribe and like this video so I know that you want to see a video where I go and visit the Montana State Prison and I talk about all the paranormal happenings that occur there. 1920 marked the downfall of Frank Connolly's reign as the warden of the Montana State Prison. As a reformer, Joseph Dixon came into power and found Connolly's management to be problematic. And it was in 1921 when Connolly officially left the prison and stopped being its warden. However, when Frank Connolly left in 1921, he took all of his investments, including equipment and infrastructure that he put into the prison as he was running it as a for-profit business, and half of the current staff. This, of course, left the new warden very upset, and he was complaining heavily that Frank Connolly defrauded the Montana State Prison. Because of this, Frank Connolly was put on trial where he was accused of defrauding Montana about $300,000. But just like the previous escape attempt that nearly cost Connolly his life, he would stand his ground and come out on top. Frank Connolly ended up being owed by Montana State about $558. While serving his time as the warden of the Montana State Prison, he was also elected mayor of Deer Lodge, being elected 3 times, winning re-election a whole bunch, and apparently serving 31 years as the mayor. And by the time he stepped down in 1929, he held the record for serving the longest term in office in Montana. After his time being the warden of the Montana State Prison, Frank Connolly put his hands in the Highway Commission. This was a group that was dedicated to putting a highway that ran all the way through the state of Montana. So if you're like me and you enjoy road trips, you are from place to place in this beautiful state, shout out Frank Connolly. Today, Connolly's legacy is deeply tied to his convict labor reform. This prison model was replicated and used as a base for a lot of surrounding states and served as an inspiration for other prison systems to run off of. However, unfortunately, after Connolly left his position of warden of the prison, and with the Great Depression hitting a couple of years later, it was really hard for new wardens to follow suit with the convict labor system. And honestly, opportunities were drying up left and right as convict labor wasn't really an option anymore. Frank Conley's story comes to an end with his wife passing away in 1939 and him soon following suit, dying on March 5th, 1939. Upon his death, the community of Deer Lodge, with him being so ingrained in it, decided to honor him by not opening shop on the day of his funeral and scattered him and his wife's ashes on Mount Powell, which is a Deer Lodge landmark. I'm going to be talking about the Billings Maniac Murders, aka the Axe Murders, that happened over a century ago. This is an unsolved and extremely brutal slaughter of a homicide, and it actually took the lives of a mother and a father of 4 children, so this is really traumatic. However, I was able to find an interview with a grandson of, these people that ended up losing their lives, and he actually had a pretty hopeful message for the end of the video. And on December 6, 1924, Nels and Annie Anderson kissed their 4 children goodbye, leaving for a pretty routine day of work. And over the day, everything seemed normal to their nanny/neighbor, Annie Erickson, who only got cause for concern as it turned to nighttime and the Andersons did not return home for the night. It wasn't until the next morning that Annie Erickson ended up calling the police and telling them that, hey, something isn't right here. I think you should look into where the Andersons are at. So the police eventually made their way to their barbershop/beauty parlor that they ran as a family business, where they found the Andersons' car sitting out in the parking lot. Not a huge cause for concern at that point, showed that they were looking in the right direction, as a person's not going to be too far away from their vehicle. So they peered inside the barbershop, where they saw Nell's arm slumped over a chair. From there, that's pretty much all they could see, but that gave them enough cause for concern to bust straight through into the building to make sure that everything was okay. Unfortunately for everyone involved, things were not okay inside of the barbershop. When they walked in, they found Nels Anderson's body slumped over that chair, hand dangling off, but most prominently, his head split from the crown all the way down to the roof of his mouth. Now, this is a horrific scene to find somebody in, but some other details of the scene were that he was wearing one glove with one glove off and in his outside coat. So in my mind, when I'm painting the picture of this scene or this area, either Nels and Annie had just came into the barbershop or they were just about to leave. Now, there's some other context clues that point to one that come up later in the story. Now that they had found Nell's body, their mission was to find out what happened to his wife, mother of his children, Annie Anderson. As they moved on looking for Annie, they got to the beauty parlor section of the building, where they found pools of blood and a bag of groceries that was drenched in what we can assume to be Annie's blood. While they found this horrific scene that painted a story of them getting groceries and then walking back into their barber shop, they could not find Annie's body until they went all the way outside into a shed. And in the shed, they found Annie, again with attack to her head noticeable, but also 3 big lacerations to her body. She, just like Nels, was in her outside clothes, big coat, ready for the winter environment, and she was clearly killed in the barbershop and then dragged to the shed. Right next to Annie's body, the police located the murder weapon, which was an axe that was actually the Andersons' own property, something that they would use to split wood in the winter. One thing of note is that the axe's handle was cleanly wiped off and there was no evidence left on the axe. While there is so much brutality and passion clearly involved in this, killing somebody with an axe, swinging an axe into a woman's body 4 times, the killer was smart enough to wash his hands in the sink, leave no trace behind, and even clean up his fingerprints on the axe, which I didn't even know that fingerprint technology was developed back then, but apparently police were still checking for fingerprints and none came up. Since we're talking about the condition of Nels and Annie's bodies, I'm going to read you this quote from this book that I've been reading. It's Montana Murderers. I also talked about Turkey Pete in my Montana State Prison video, but this is a book that I've gotten that just talks about some of the craziest, murder cases that happen in Montana. And well, I found this case from this book. I actually did most of my research online, but I did find a really good quote from this book, which is actually a quote from the Great Falls Tribune, which is another town in Montana. And the quote apparently goes, "His head," talking about Nels, "was split from the crown to the roof of his mouth, while his wife bore at least 3 axe wounds, the deepest of which almost split the skull in twine." So that's clearly extremely brutal, and a lot of passion must have went into this murder, or like most of the news articles at the time were saying, that this was clearly the work of a maniac, a frenzied person coming in that just enjoys slaughtering people. But then at the same time, the murderer was thorough and thoughtful enough to clean up after himself. Another thing that added a little bit of mystery to these murders is that the bodies were not robbed, the cash register was not disturbed. Everything in the building seemed to be untouched except for that beauty parlor section where Annie unfortunately lost her life. From here, it was the police's job to solve what happened to the Andersons and find some justice for their murders. Now, like I mentioned, there was no sign of robbery, and apparently there was no one in the Andersons' life that would make sense to want to hurt them. So they kept looking into other leads. Now, apparently, there was one lead that surfaced from a woman who across the street had heard yelling coming from the barbershop at around 9 p.m. the night before on December 6th. This person was also able to see inside the barbershop and described a tall, yelling, darker complexion man, maybe of Mexican descent, yelling at the Andersons, getting into a little kerfuffle. But this lead eventually did fizzle, and no darker complexion man was ever questioned about this. One thing I will note, many sources that I looked into, including articles that I read and the story from this book, reference how the police at the time were quoted as saying that the nature of this crime did not seem to align with what they thought a Mexican perpetrator would do, saying that Mexicans were more inclined to use a pistol or a knife and not use an axe in a murder. Now, of course, this is kind of a silly notion. Anyone of any race can kill anybody else in any kind of way. There was just a weird prejudice saying that a Mexican man would not kill a person with an axe. He would actually kill them with a knife or a pistol. I was just like a little silly. Like, no, only white dudes kill people with axes. Now, the most prominent theory that the police were able to come up with at the time was that someone from their city definitely did not cause these murders, but there was a train track that was near to the barbershop. So what they presumed happened was that a crazed man hopped on a train, rode all the way through Billings, and then went on his killing spree, killing the Andersons in their barbershop in an act of barbarousness and just straight craze. Literally the work of a maniac. And just as quickly as he rode into Billings on a train, he hopped on the next one straight out of town, getting out scot-free, running away onto the next town to cause more mania. Now, as time passed, the Andersons' children are unfortunately all gone now. Like I mentioned, this happened over a century ago at this point, but in 2024, for the 100-year anniversary of this unfortunate event, one of their grandchildren did come to the town and actually visit the graves of Nels and Andy Anderson and had some pretty honestly hopeful things to say. That grandson is Glenn Pomeroy, and he had a vested interest in keeping their memory alive and putting some love, memory, and careful thought into their name. After doing kind of a deep dive into this senseless, brutal crime that is still unsolved to this day, it was kind of a relief to see their grandson visit their graves, put respect on their memory, and have such a vested interest in his grandparents. He also discussed how his mom would talk to him with such fond memories of her parents, which would of course be Nels and Annie Anderson, and it was a very nice, warm moment to think of the light and the good side of their family and not necessarily the tragic murders of his grandparents. Like I mentioned at the beginning of this video, this case is unsolved, and unfortunately no one was ever convicted of these brutal murders that took place in Billings, Montana just over a century ago. Thinking back, it's actually, we're in between the 100th and 101st
anniversary of this murder, so I still caught it when it was exactly 100 years old. And like I mentioned, I originally got this idea from this book, even though I did most of my research online. But this book is filled with solved and unsolved mysteries. I think if I make a video like this in the future, I'll do like maybe 3 unsolved cases, just so it's a little bit more cathartic, because just having a case that is unsolved, I think, leaves a lot hanging in the air. Regardless, I hope you did enjoy this video. What do you guys think happened? Supposedly, this couple had no enemies, and a lot of people in the community vouched for them. Something that was said by their grandson in the video that I watched, where he was talking about his grandparents and his mother, the way he described them opening up their barbershop business was because they strolled into town and noticed a lot of folks that could use a shave and a haircut, so they opened up a barbershop. And I think it's a very Montana thing to do. Show up to your community, do what needs to be done of you, and really provide for the people around you. That was up until 1924, where they were sadly taken from their community and their 4 young children. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Devin. This is Montana After Midnight, and I'm gonna quickly bug you about these hoodies. I recently just made these that seem cooler back. I designed this to have something to wear myself, and I just noticed that a couple of my family members just bought some, so that's really sick. Before smoke jumping began in 1939, wildland firefighting was much slower, rougher, and far more grueling. Crews had to reach fires on foot, horseback, or by mule train, sometimes hiking day and night with heavy tools and supplies strapped right on their backs. Remote fires were spotted by a Forest Service lookout perched in towers who relayed the word by phone, telegraph, or radio. Once on site, firefighters relied on the same hand tools that smoke jumpers would later carry, such as Pulaskis, shovels, axes, crosscut saws, McLeods, and water bags, all of which they hauled through rivers, steep canyons, and dense timber. Without the cargo drops, crews had to pack in their own food and bedrolls, eating simple meals such as canned goods, and often slept on the bare ground. Firefighting itself meant carving miles of fire line by hand, throwing dirt onto flames, and sometimes setting backfires which would rob the wildfire of fuel. But without modern equipment such as fire shelters or rapid escape options, survival depended on quick thinking and favorable terrain. By the late 1930s, the Forest Service realized that some fires were simply too remote and fast-moving to be reached in time. Luckily, with the introduction of aviation and some creative minds, we were able to put together the radical idea of parachuting firefighters directly into the wilderness, aka the smoke jumping program was born. Without further ado, let's jump into the tragedy of the Mann Gulch fire. But before we do that, I want to break down the history of smoke jumping, as well as set the scene of what a smoke jumper might bring in to a fire that they're parachuting into, as well as talking about the area of Mann Gulch, the gates of the Rocky Mountains, as Lewis and Clark called it, because I think that background information is very useful. Anyway, without further ado, I really appreciate you being here with me. Let's get into the video. The smoke jumping program was created to serve as the first line of defense against wildfires, dropping from the sky to reach fires in places where roads and trails simply could not. A general idea of the smoke jumping program, according to the Forest Service, was by parachuting self-sufficient firefighters to reach the fire, they could arrive fresh and ready for the strenuous work that was fighting fires in rugged terrain. The program began as an experiment in 1939 in the Pacific Northwest. Just a year later, in 1940, Rufus Robertson and Earl Cooley made the first official fire jump in the Nez Perce National Forest, proving that the concept could work. Following this jump, Montana quickly became a central part of smoke jumping history. An early base was built and known as the 9 Mile Camp. This was northwest of Missoula, but over time the operations moved over to Missoula itself, with a smoke jumper base being built there. This base eventually became one of the most important hubs for smoke jumper operations in the entire region and the entire US. While the development of smoke jumping was exciting and rapidly growing, the early days of aerial deployment involved a lot of danger, as the equipment and the procedure had to be invented from scratch. With World War II reaching America, smoke jumping would soon intersect with the military. The US government created the Civilian Public Service, or the CPS, for men who were
conscientious objectors. These COs were offered work of national importance, which included smoke jumping. The first CPS smoke jumper unit was based in Missoula, Montana. By the end of the war, nearly 240 COs had been trained as smoke jumpers, and they played a critical role in keeping the program alive, while the local men who would usually be jumping out of planes risking their lives decided to do it overseas instead. Also in late 1944, Japan launched Fogo balloon bombs, which were hydrogen bombs carrying incendiaries and sometimes explosive devices designed to ride the jet stream and ignite wildfires across the US. There was 9,000 launched and roughly 300 made it to landfall from Alaska all the way down to Mexico. Most caused little damage, but they were taken seriously as a potential threat. To counter it, the Army turned to the 555th Parachute Infantry Battalion, the first all-black paratrooper unit known as the Triple Nickels. 555. Instead of fighting overseas, they were assigned the secret Firefly Project, parachuting into remote forest as smoke jumpers. They trained in Pendleton, Oregon, and were dispatched to fight fires that could have been sparked by balloon bombs. None of the fires that they fought were sparked by these balloon bombs, but they fought dozens of lightning-caused fires in extremely rough terrain. Eventually, World War II came to a close and smoke jumping went back to business as normal. Fast forward to 1948, Montana experienced an unusual year. Floods and heavy moisture all but replaced the typical fire season. Missoula jumpers saw limited action and went all the way down to southern Utah for fire jumping work. This quiet season soon passed as just a year later, on August 4th, 1949, the Mann Gulch fire erupted in the Montana wilds near Helena. Mann Gulch is located in northern Montana within the Gates of the Mountains Wilderness, part of Helena National Forest, which is about an hour and 15 minutes away from Helena itself. It lies along the Missouri River and a rugged canyon stretch named by Meriwether Lewis in July of 1805. As the Corps of Discovery pushed upriver, Lewis marveled at the sheer cliffs rising hundreds of feet above the water, writing in his journal how the river appears to have forced its way through the immense body of solid rock for a distance of 5 3/4 miles, concluding that from the singular appearance of the place, I called it the Gates of the Rocky Mountain. Looking at the map, you could see why he would consider this to be the gate of the Rocky Mountains, as via their route, this is where the mountains started to erupt out of the ground, breaking up the plains that come eastward of the Rocky Mountains. Tall rocky outcrops and the broken cliffs make movement difficult, while also funneling immense winds. In 1949, the lower gulch was dominated by cheatgrass and bunchgrass, fine fuels that ignite easily and burn explosively. Scattered ponderosa pine and patches of Douglas fir dotted the slopes, while sparse brush allowed fire to carry rapidly throughout the grass in a flashy fashion. Today, the area has seen regrowth, and grass remains a serious fire hazard. Summers in Mann Gulch are hot, dry, and windy, and create prime fire conditions with an afternoon upslope winds that accelerate fire spread throughout the canyons. In 1949, the gulch was remote with no roads. Only the river and steep trails provided access. Today, visitors can hike into the gulch from the Missouri River or surrounding ridges, where memorial crosses that mark the spots where each smoke jumper fell, making it both an historic site as well as a solemn place of remembrance. The Missouri River, if you didn't know, is the longest river in the United States, and it flows for more than 2,500 miles from its headwaters near Three Forks, Montana, to its confluence with the Mississippi River at St. Louis. In 1976, Congress designated that 149 miles of the upper Missouri as part of the National Wild and Scientific River System, calling it an irreplaceable legacy of historic American West. Along the way, the river sustains a rich ecosystem. Its valley is a geological record of an ancient inland sea that once covered much of the Great Plains, leaving behind layered formations that were later folded, faulted, and uplifted into rugged landscapes visible today. Historically, the river was a vital artery of the Western expansion, and Lewis and Clark spent 3 weeks in 1805 exploring this very section, which remains a premier component of the Lewis and Clark National Historic Trail. Today, the upper Missouri continues to draw visitors with opportunities to float the waters, fish, hike, camp, hunt, and experience the solitude of Montana's backcountry, while also providing important contributions to the local lifestyles and the region's economy. The young men sent out into the remote wilderness carried a carefully selected set of tools. Axes, shovels, and saws were commonplace, but above all was the Pulaski. A Pulaski is a combination of an axe and a hoe, and it is truly a firefighter's weapon. It was invented in 1911 by Assistant Ranger Ed Pulaski after Idaho's devastating Great Fire of 1910, which highlighted the need for better equipment. By 1936, the Pulaski had become a Forest Service standard. Another notable piece of equipment was the McLeod. It's a rake and a hoe and a tamper all mixed together, designed for scraping and clearing. Fun fact about me, the McLeod is my favorite landscaping tool. 2 summers ago, I spent my days on a grounds crew working on a dude ranch. I first used the McLeod when I was working on a mountain biking trail, and we had to fix a small stream that was running straight through the trail. And from that project forward, I always loved the McLeod. It's extremely versatile, and it pretty much just gets the job done. It's sturdy, and I love it. Anyway, I was super excited to learn that it was originally invented for wildfire containment, which makes it even cooler. The McLeod was created in 1905 by Forest Service Ranger Malcolm McLeod, and it quickly became a firefighting staple by the 1930s and into the 1940s. While the McLeod is my personal favorite, in my research looking into the Mann Gulch fire, it suggests that the Pulaski has become much more of the iconic firefighting tool. Norman MacLean, in his book Young Men and Fire, even takes the time to describe the Pulaski in heavy detail and emphasizes its importance. Now, I also can admit that an axe mixed with a hoe is much cooler than a rake that you can tamp the ground with, so I can see why the Pulaski became much more iconic. The Pulaski's design made it perfect for chopping through roots, cutting brush, and digging into soft soil. On the fire line, smoke jumpers and grounds crew used Pulaskis to dig through control lines, stripping the ground all the way down to its bare soil, intending to stop the flames from spreading. Its versatility allowed for firefighters to both cut and dig without the need for separate tools. The McLeod, by contrast, was designed for more clearing than chopping. With a wide hoe blade on one side and rake-like tips on the other, it was perfect for scraping away grass and leaves, or for smoothing out a fire line after it was dug. In operation, the McLeods were often used right after the Pulaski. Once the heavier digging and chopping was done, the McLeod could be used to clean up the line down to its bare earth, ensuring that no fuel remained to carry the fire across. Together, these two tools formed the backbone of firefighting suppression in the mid-20th century. Besides tools, smoke jumpers in the 1940s also carried a small but essential set of survival items: a letdown rope in case any of them were hung up in a tree, a canteen for drinking water, a very basic first aid kit, and simple rations, often K-rations or canned food. Most importantly, they carried matches. This detail is crucial to the Mann Gulch story, as it became the spark of both one of the survival stories and the biggest controversy of the tragedy. Matches were issued to wilderness firefighters for the purpose of setting a backfire. A backfire is a strategic tool where firefighters light a blaze in front of the firing line that they've created. The new fire burns towards the approaching fire, consuming all the grass and brush before the main fire can reach them. When done correctly, the wildfire runs out of fuel and loses momentum, and it hits the already burnt ground. Backfiring was an official firefighting method, but it required near perfect conditions and wasn't always successful. Before these young men could even use any of these tools, they would need to earn their name of smoke jumper. They would do this by jumping out of planes over rugged terrain, nearing and accompanying raging fire. By 1949, the act of jumping from a plane was routine and was guided by strict and simple systems, but it still carried its dangers. The smoke jumping crew flew a C-47, which was stripped of its seats, which would make room for the men and their gear. When the plane reached the fire site, the jump master opened the door and carefully judged the surroundings. This was the terrain, wind, and fire behavior. Once a spot was chosen, the men prepared to leap. They wore heavy canvas jumpsuits padded at the elbows, hips, and knees, along with football-style helmets and let-down ropes. The jumpers would line up at the door, and they clipped a static line which attached their parachute pack. This was a cable that was inside the aircraft, which meant when they stepped out into the rushing wind and dropped from the plane, the static line would yank their parachute open automatically. The day of the Mann Gulch fire tragedy, the men dropped in groups of 4. They would be tapped on the knee when the spotter wanted them to jump. As the men descended towards the rugged ridges and dense timber, they would try to steer as best they could with little toggles, although the control was limited compared to modern parachutes. It was common for smoke jumpers to land in trees where the let-down rope would allow them to rappel safely to the ground. After landing, their gear was dropped separately in cargo containers. These cargo containers were also attached to parachutes, and after landing, the jumpers would regroup with each other, collect their tools, get their gear, and move towards the fire. Since 1949, the equipment has improved quite a bit, and at the end of this video, I will be going into the modern smoke jumping system and equipment, but for now, I think it's time we finally discuss the actual day and tragedy of the Mann Gulch fire. It was a hot day in early August, 97 degrees to be exact, so hot that it was said to be a record at the time, although decades later temperatures had been recorded as high as 105. By August, the Gulch had turned a dusty, dry brown, and conditions were no doubt much hotter than the recorded temperature in Helena of 97 at the time. Originally, the Forest Service had called for 25 men to be sent to Mann Gulch, but only 16 men could be spared from the Missoula base camp. Those 16 would soon find themselves in for a turbulent and fateful mission. Leading them was their foreman, R. Wagner Dodge, otherwise known as Wag. At 33, Dodge was a seasoned firefighter with more than a decade of experience over most of his crew members. But age and experience wasn't the only thing that separated him and the crew members that were sent out on this mission. In smoke jumping culture, it is tradition for crews to work, train, and spend downtime together, building trust and camaraderie that often meant the difference between life and death out in the field. Dodge, however, was so skilled, he had a completely different routine from his crew members. He was often sent on mechanical work and repairing things inside of the base camp, which meant that he did not have a lot of time to build that tight-knit community with the rest of his crew members. And by some accounts, on the day of the fire, he hadn't even learned every single crew member's name when he was sent to Mann Gulch. Accompanying the crew members on the plane was Earl Cooley. He played the important role of spotter, and it was his job to find a safe and secure place for the smoke jumpers to land. He had to track the wind, the terrain, and the distance between the jumpers, and he was also in charge of dropping the cargo after the last jumper had landed, basically setting up the target location to have everything that all the jumpers would possibly need. And if you were paying close attention, you would know that Cooley was also one of the first smoke jumpers to ever do it. I referenced him earlier in this video, and he was one of the people that proved that the concept of smoke jumping could work a decade earlier, and he clearly stuck with the art and history of smoke jumping. The flight was rough, so rough that one man even refused to jump, leaving only 15 smoke jumpers to confront the fire. Cooley did eventually locate a spot for the men to jump on the north ridge of the Mann Gulch, which was on the opposite side of the fire. They went out in groups of 4, with each man hoping to be picked really early because that's how sickening this flight was. It was so turbulent, the men just wanted to jump out of the airplane, literally. With all the men out of the plane, Jim Cooley set the cargo down, and only 2 things were damaged in their descent down to Mann Gulch. One of them was Wagner Dodge, who actually cut his arm so bad that the bone was showing, but he was able to bandage himself up relatively quickly. The other thing that was damaged was their one and only radio, which was completely destroyed and unusable. With Dodge quickly bandaging himself up, it was his job to direct the crew and their job to listen to his orders. The second in command was a 28-year-old seasoned smoke jumper named Bill Hellman. He was the second oldest jumper compared to Dodge and had the second most experience. Hellman's role was to repeat Dodge's commands down the line and hold the position near the rear, ensuring that no man fell behind while Dodge led from the front. Hellman had a better relationship with the men and was seen as a loyal member of the smoke jumping crew. After the jump, the men gathered themselves, meeting up and waiting for Dodge's first order. However, soon after landing, the men and Dodge could hear shouting from lower on the ridge, making it apparent that they were not on the ridge alone.
Dodge's first order was for the men to collect all the gear and huddle up together while he went lower on the ridge to investigate who was making the noise calling out for help. In his search lower on the ridge, Dodge encountered James Harrison, a fire guard who had already been on the fire for several hours before the smoke jumpers arrived. Harrison was no stranger to smoke jumping, and he had once been a smoke jumper himself the previous year. However, he resigned due to his mother's worries of the job being too dangerous, and that day he had hiked up the ridge and started fighting the fire all by himself using his previous smoke jumper knowledge. According to Dodge, Harrison looked extremely exhausted after battling the fire by himself for hours on end, and was very delighted to see that the smoke jumpers had arrived and that he could take some of the pressure off of his back. Harrison had been on patrol that morning and reported the fire from his station in the Meriwether Canyon area, and then he had crossed the Missouri River by boat, hiked up the Gulch, and started working on controlling the fire. Now is a good time to talk about that during the summer, there is a phenomenon where thunderstorms and lightning can appear, but the dry conditions cause any rain to evaporate before actually even hitting the ground. This means that lightning has the dangerous capability of hitting completely dry and flammable foliage at incredible temperatures, sparking disastrous wildfires. This is an extremely common cause of wildfires and is exactly what happened that morning in Mann Gulch, which created this now infamous fire. After surveying the flames and speaking with the exhausted Harrison, Dodge devised a plan of attack. The men would flank the fire from the west by hiking down and across the north slope, while making an open escape route to the Missouri River. Regrouping with the smoke jumpers, Dodge issued the order to head west. With Dodge at the front and Hellman bringing up the rear of the crew, the men made the march towards the river. A sudden gust of wind funneled through the gulch, carrying burning embers from high up on the south slope down into the grass at the base of the north slope, creating a spot fire, which is an offshoot sparked by embers of a main fire. Within moments, this spot fire exploded into a blow-up. And a blow-up is the term used when a fire that seemed controllable rapidly intensifies to the point where it cannot be controlled any longer. This is extremely dangerous and a horrifying spot for a firefighter to be in. This blow-up formed due to the unique wind conditions of cool and hot air battling each other and creating a chimney-like effect, which caused the fire to spread in completely unexpected ways. And in an instant, the crew's escape route to the Missouri River, a well-thought-out planned attack, was completely cut off, and the men were surrounded by flames. Their only chance to escape this impending fire was to race up the steep ridge before they were overtaken by one of nature's most violent forces. Dodge immediately gave the order for the men to turn around and climb to the top of the mountain. Backtracking up the ridge was grueling, but it was the only call for the wilderness firefighter to make. In fact, both of Dodge's orders so far have been standard practice for the Forest Service protocol, and given the circumstances, were pretty much the best options available. His first command to head towards the river would have offered an ideal escape route if the fire grew out of control, giving the men a chance to safely regroup, not accounting for the unexpected spot fire that completely cut them off before they could even get there. Then, once it had became clear that the fire had cut off that initial route, the only safe ground was higher up on the ridge. Now, unfortunately, wildfire behavior was poorly understood at the time, and smoke jumping itself was still in its infancy. These limitations meant that even the best calls set the stage for this disaster that followed. Somewhere between 200 and 500 yards into their retreat, Dodge had gave another critical order: drop all of your equipment. He knew in his heart that this was no longer a mission to battle a raging fire, but it was a race for survival. And anything that would slow a man down would cost him his life. That being said, only about half of the crew threw down their McLeods and Pulaskis. In Young Men and Fire, Norman McLean suggests that for some, letting go of their tools was unthinkable. Simply put, they were Forest Service firefighters, the best of the best, and to drop their shovels felt like surrender, and as though that they were no longer sent there to control the fire, but to flee from it, which was just too much for them to take. McLean points out the 10 o'clock fire policy, the idea that every wildfire should be brought under control by 10 a.m.,
the next morning after the fire was started, and the smoke jumpers were the tip of the spear of this aggressive attack. They were parachuting in to crush these fires before they even had a chance to spread. Most fires were routine and were wrapped up quickly, so when the crew dropped into Mann Gulch, they believed that they were facing yet another 10 o'clock fire, and it was nothing that they couldn't handle. But now they were being told to drop their fire-killing tools and to run away, which was just unthinkable at the time. At this point after the order, the fire was getting louder, making it harder for the men to hear each other, and the smoke was filling up their lungs as they marched up the ridge. The ridge itself was brutally steep at about a 76 grade, which is more than twice as steep as the highest incline most treadmills can be set to. In less than half a mile, they had to climb 600 feet of elevation, scrambling for their lives, while the fire charged uphill at nearly 600 feet per minute, which is faster than an average man can sprint on flat ground, let alone this extreme angle that the men had to climb up. As the men marched up the ridge, with their lungs burning from smoke and exertion, it became clear that they would never be able to outrun this fire. The wall of flames was devouring the gulch below, racing upslope with a terrifying speed, and every step the crew took, the inferno crept closer to them. With the men strung out behind him on the steep hillside, Dodge stopped and looked back at the quickly approaching fire, then looked at the distant hill that the men still needed to climb. He knew that they would not be able to reach the peak in time, and in a move that seemed insane to the others, he struck a match and lit the tall, dry grass all around him. I told you that those matches would be important earlier. While doing so, he commanded his men to join him and stick close as he burned away the surrounding ground. But no one stopped. Even the most experienced men on the ground thought that he was crazy, passing him and striving to the top. One man even yelled as he passed, "To hell with that, I'm getting out of here." As the crew raced towards the top of the ridge, Robert Seeley and Walter Rumsey spotted a narrow crack in the rock wall. In a split second, they chose to dart right into it, gambling that it might lead to safety. Just behind those two men was Eldon Dietert, and he saw them disappear into the chute, but instead of going with them, he decided to stick with the majority of the men racing towards the top of the ridge. Sully and Rumsey scrambled through the crevice and came out onto a rocky hillside. From there, they bolted downslope to a patch of exposed rock where the flames could not reach them. As they huddled in that refuge, they looked down and caught a glimpse of Dodge. Dodge was completely alone, and he had lit all of the grass around him. It was now a barren patch of blackened earth. As the wall of flames roared up the ridge, Dodge laid face down in the ash, pressing a wet handkerchief right up against his mouth. The fire slammed over him with the roar of an emerging freight train, pushing him all around. When the fire passed, Dodge rose with only minor burns, surrounded by silence and a blackened, burnt slope. His men were nowhere in sight. Meanwhile, with Dodge being safe, the flames reached Sally and Rumsey's rock slide. They had maneuvered desperately within the rock slide to keep distance between themselves and the flames until they eventually made it out on the other side as the flames passed, sparing their lives. Their location, that rock slide which saved their lives, would later be known as Rescue Gulch. At the top of the ridge separating Mann Gulch from Rescue Gulch is a flat area large enough to gather a group. The landscape was eerie and devastated. The fire had swept through with a brutal efficiency, leaving behind a blackened, smoking slope. During the race against the fire, Robert Sully and Walter Rumsey followed the north edge of Dodge's escape fire to the ridgetop, successfully escaping all of the flames. After the blowup subsided, they found Bill Hellman, who followed the south edge of Dodge's escape fire towards the top of the ridge. He was badly burned, but still alive. Dodge, who had survived by lying in his own fire, joined Sully and Rumsey and reported that he had found Joseph Sylvia alive, but also badly burnt. After the three men met up, Dodge and Sully proceeded down Rescue Gulch all the way to the Missouri River to seek help, while Rumsey would stay with Hellman. Sylvia was reported to be in a state of euphoria and absurdly optimistic about his dire state. It's speculated that this state of euphoria occurred because all of his nerve endings were burnt to a crisp and his body was in a severe state of shock. A rescue crew eventually arrived at 12:30 a.m. on August 6th and assisted Dodge in searching for and recovering the men. By 1:30 a.m., the crew located Sylvia and Hellman and began providing medical care. Both Hellman and Sylvia were eventually evacuated by 5 a.m., but unfortunately, tragically passed away in Helena's hospital the next day. The remaining 11 men and their charred equipment were all found within 300 yards of each other, and unfortunately, as you can assume, none of them survived. Among those men that lost their lives was Eldon Dietert. It was his 19th birthday, and he wasn't even assigned to jump in the Mann Gulch fire, but decided to help out and jump anyway. During the blow-up stage, the Mann Gulch fire burned an estimated 3,000 acres in about 10 minutes, and eventually it was reported that it consumed 4,300 acres in total. A total of 611 firefighters were used to bring this fire under control, which you don't need me to tell you that that is a far cry from the 16 firefighters originally sent to handle the Mann Gulch fire. Hello, I've been working on this video for so long. I didn't just get a haircut, I didn't just shave my beard. Completely moved. This is the new setup. I'm gonna make it look nicer. I don't know if this is where the camera's gonna live. You'd be surprised at how hard it is to find an appealing looking backdrop. So this is my best attempt. We're just moving in, but I want to finish this video because I put a lot of work into it. So, new area. Let's go. So it's hard to talk about Mann Gulch without mentioning Young Men and Fire. This is a book that I've been throwing around the entire video up to this point. And what it's all about is Norman McLean's journey on not just explaining what happened on Mann Gulch, but also doing an investigation on the things that have been lost over time within the Mann Gulch tragedy itself. This is like specific locations where certain men met their end, as well as where Dodge lit his fire. These things were all loosely marked at the time that they occurred, and they have little markings where they're at now, but when he was looking into it in the 70s, a lot of this was worn down, and there was a lot of confusion about where exactly things occurred. So I'm gonna do two things. One, I'm gonna illustrate for you what exactly happened on Mann Gulch, because I know it can be kind of confusing once you get into the nitty-gritty about like, wait, that happened where? This happened where? So I'm gonna break it down on the whiteboard for you in just a second. And then after I do that, I'm going to go over the controversy of what the heck happened, why are people upset, and the aftermath of the fire after all these men unfortunately lost their lives. All right, new section of the video. It's a whiteboard section. I just poured myself a beautiful cup of caffeine-free Diet Coke, not sponsored, but I did go to Whitefish Oktoberfest, paid $30 for this mug, so I had to show it off. And it was a Montana thing I did, and this is Montana After Midnight. How cool. But I can be sponsored by Montana After Midnight merch. You guys can go pick up some if you really want to and help support me while I make cool videos like this on Montana history. Anyway, let's get into the whiteboard section. When I was listening to the audiobook and I was watching some documentaries on what happened in Mann Gulch and reading about it, things made sense, but as soon as I decided to start talking about it, I realized that I didn't have a clear map of what happened, and a lot of the maps online aren't super definitive. Like, some of them seem to conflict with other maps. So I'm going to draw for you really quickly a rough sketch of all the chaos that happened on Mann Gulch in 1949. So this very basic drawing that I've done so far, I highlighted the North Ridge and the South Ridge. And if you didn't know, a gulch, which this is obviously Mann Gulch, it's like that little dip right there. So this is the gulch, this is Mann Gulch, that's where the fire is happening. And then this at the bottom, of course, is the Missouri River. The initial fire took place on the South Ridge. So it was going on like over here in this area. So when James Harrison went up the Missouri, he was somewhere over here fighting the fire on the South Ridge. Of course, like any good whiteboard demonstration, all my markers are like running out of ink and everything is falling apart. So I'm basically a teacher. Now our Smokejumping crew, led by Dodge Wagner, they landed right around here. They're up on the north ridge. This is where they found a safe spot. They all landed right here. They're regrouping right there. They parachuted down. So there's a little guy on his little parachute. This is where Dodge decides to meet up with James Harrison. Now, some of the maps have this little swoop of them meeting over here. Some of them don't even acknowledge James Harrison, but you can assume that they met kind of in the Gulch, in the deepest valley between the South Ridge and the North Ridge. They kind of looked at the fire that was on the South Ridge, and that's when Wagner Dodge decided that his plan of attack was to hike westward on the North Ridge down to the Missouri River, which is when, of course, tragedy struck, or all plans got thrown out of whack. And that's because the spot fire started to pop up over here, and then those spot fires turned into a blow up. And a blow up, like I mentioned earlier, is an uncontrollable fire, and some diagrams even seem to show it converging with the original fire. And oh my goodness, there's this huge fire working towards the Gulch, and the men never ever made it down to the Missouri River, which would have, given them safety through the water. They could have crossed the river and been safe. So their escape route was basically cut off before they could even start trying to fight the fire. So the fire is now pushing up this way, and Dodge makes the call that the men need to now run up the ridge. So they're kind of going in this direction, kind of back and up, because like I said, this is a huge ridge here. It's a gulch, so this is super steep, and they decide that they need to kind of run up it. But because it's so steep, remember, it is steeper than any normal treadmill will even incline to. It's so steep that these men, especially weighed down with their equipment, are going to be struggling to climb. So Dodge, pretty much right away says, hey, drop everything. Literally barely moved 200 yards before he was like, all right, everyone drop everything. Somewhere running up the ridge, Dodge decides that it's hopeless, and he decides to light his own escape fire. Here's a close-up version of Dodge's escape fire. So the fire is chasing up after the men as they're all running this way to try to get to the peak of the ridge. Now there's two sides to the ridge. This is the side that has the fire, which leads to the south ridge of the Mann Gulch, and then the Missouri River is down here. But the fire is right on their tails as they need to run up the ridge. So Dodge, looking at the fire, then looking at the ridge, realizes they're not going to make it. So he starts lighting his escape fire and yelling at the men, who all disregard his orders, that they need to stick with him and start lighting the grass on fire. Rumsey and Sully run underneath him, and they find a crack in the ridge. Eldon Diedert was also right behind them, but Eldon Diedert decides to continue running up the ridge instead of going through the crack. Sully and Rumsey make it through the crack. They get to a rock slide, which basically saves their lives because the fire goes around the rock slide. But the fire keeps pushing, even past Dodge's escape fire, which is all burnt out. He lays down in his escape fire. All the other men ran above his escape fire, still trying to make it stop the ridge. But eventually, the fire moved all the way past all of them, including Dodge, all of them, sparing Rumsey and Sully's life because they found a safe haven in a rock slide, which basically couldn't burn, so the fire had to go around it. And I'm just going to say it's right here, even though my marker's not working. And then Dodge was also safe, which I guess I'll just scribble it out too, because the fire couldn't burn his already pre-burnt grass due to his quick thinking. Unfortunately, all the other men got caught up in the flames before they could make it to the safety of the top of the ridge. And it's in that chase that most of the men lost their lives, some of them gravely injured and then died a day later, while only 3 of the smoke jumpers were able to survive with their lives due to basically quick thinking and a lot of luck. When talking about the book itself, Young Men on Fire, I want to highlight one thing is that it is a hard book to follow. There are so many new people that come into the fold. This is a story of decades
where Norman McLean is literally trying to come at every single angle, and he hits constant dead ends up until the point where he can confidently say that he's comfortable with the conclusion that he found, but it literally took him multiple trips to Mann Gulch and multiple different angles to actually get to his conclusion. So the book kind of goes back and forth a lot, introduces a lot of new people, and it is hard to follow. However, it's a key resource if you're looking into the Mann Gulch tragedy, or if you're really into wildfire fighting. I think it's definitely worth checking out, and it is a good book. It can be a lot at sometimes. And like I just mentioned, the book goes into historical figures that had their hands in the Mann Gulch fire, even if they weren't physically there. This is experts that dedicated their time and part of their careers to looking into the Mann Gulch fire, and I think it gives you a big, wider scope of it. It's not just these 16 men that went in to fight the fire. There's a whole bunch of other people, even other fires that are going on at the same time, that kind of set up the stage for the Mann Gulch fire. So it's again a really great resource. One thing that is at the center of the book and the controversy of the Mann Gulch fire is Dodge's escape fire. Something really cool about the escape fire is that not only did it save Dodge's life, but it also is taught to new wildfire fighting people that go into the Forest Service as a legitimate survival tactic. And while it's useful today, although very rarely used, back in the day it was the cause of this main controversy, and it caused a lot of questions against the Forest Service for negligence. And the main reason why lawsuits came up and people were upset is because there was no way to definitively prove if Dodge's escape fire just confused and scared his men, causing them to run in front of him. And then also there is a slight chance that his own fire is what consumed his men as they ran past him, basically joining up with the other fire, giving it more momentum to carry up the cliff and basically burn his men alive after he lit it. And that is the heart of the controversy, and it didn't really help that the government then classified some of the files talking about the Mann Gulch fire that day, making people have distrust and, what's going on here. Looking further into Norman McLean's Young Men and Fire and him trying to solve the mystery of what exactly happened that day, the truth of the matter, we come to find out that of the 3 survivors, only Rumsey and Sully lived long enough to work with Norman McLean, whereas Dodge unfortunately passed away only 5 years after the Mann Gulch fire. Rumsey and Sully's accounts were super valuable, but they didn't always align with each other or with the official reports. And one of the most important questions still remained: where exactly was Dodge's escape fire? That is at the heart of the question, because from there, we can determine if it was his fire that ended up causing these 13 men to lose their lives that day. It's years after the fire occurred, when Rumsey and Sully were fully grown into men, no longer being teenage boys. They went back to Mann Gulch with McLean, and they hoped to make a definitive map of what exactly happened that day. The first and main key site that Rumsey, Sully, and McLean ended up heading to on that ridge was the crack in the ridge that the 2 men used to escape the fire, leading them to that rock slide where they were able to allow the fire to pass by them, securing their survival. There was a couple key differences, although it has been decades since their escape was actually in swing. One big change between then and now is the crack seemed a lot smaller and it was harder for the men to get through, although they were able to get through and go to the other side and find a rock slide. Another key difference was there was a juniper bush, which one of the men had fallen into after escaping through the crack, and he almost gave up while lying in this bush, so it was a key part of his story. When they got outside the crack, they found out that that bush was no longer a juniper bush, and of course these are all Forest Service guys, so they know their foliage pretty well, so they were all a little bit confused why this bush changed from a juniper bush to a bush of a different species. However, it was just chalked up to misremembering, and it gave the men a good laugh. Regardless, the men pushed forward to that rock slide that saved their lives that day, and from that rock slide, the 2 men, Rumsey and Sully, debated on where Dodge was standing when he lit his escape fire. Each of the men contributed key details that aligned with official reports, but didn't always align with each other in the macro. Rumsey believed one thing, Sully believed another, and the official report was somewhere in the middle. The men could not come to a definitive conclusion, although were able to roughly say where Dodge's escape fire was. That being said, with their memories being vivid in some areas, but also contradictory in others, The mystery of Dodge's escape fire seemed to linger, and Norman McLean wasn't satisfied with the conclusion that they came to. So, years later, Norman McLean returned to Mann Gulch, but this time he was accompanied by a scientist, Richard Rothermel. On this journey, the two men split up, trying to triangulate an exact location of where Dodge lit his escape fire and hopefully get rid of any doubts that Dodge could have been the person that condemned his men to die by lighting it. Now, while Norman McLean was on his journey trying to triangulate a whole bunch of different stories and maps and, rough estimates of yardage by men that were on the scene at the time, he found another crack in the ridge, this one being far larger than the one that he found with Rumsey and Solly, kind of lining up to what they were saying with the other one being too small. And then at the other side, he was able to find a juniper bush. This realization suggests that maybe they were at the wrong crack back when they went with Rumsey and Solly, and their accounts actually aligned much better together than what they previously thought, and that Dodge's position might have been at a completely different location when they went through the smaller crack. So with this key piece of information, and then also tag teaming old maps and other pieces of evidence, the men were able to meet where they thought that Dodge's escape fire would have been lit, and there was key evidence that this was the actual legitimate spot. The proof that they had found the official location where Dodge lit his escape fire was a marker left in 1949. This marker had been buried over decades of overgrowth and pounded down by winter snow and all this kind of stuff, so the marker was completely buried, but these men were able to find it due to their keen observation, proving that on their last expedition with Rumsey and Solly, Norman McLean actually went to the wrong crack, and where just a couple years prior they thought they found Dodge's escape fire that rubbed McLean wrong, was wrong. And this was the actual location where Dodge lit his escape fire. Kind of crazy, big stuff. With now knowing where Dodge lit his fire, having the exact location, Norman McLean, alongside fire scientists, researchers, was able to prove that it wasn't Dodge's escape fire that led to the other 13 men losing their lives on the hill. The main fire would have overtook them regardless. So in the end, the work that was put into Young Men and Fire ended up being able to help clear Dodge's name, showing that his actions weren't of negligence and fear, but just a desperate attempt to survive an impossible situation that did not make that situation any worse. Also, Rothermel's work at Mann Gulch didn't just help McLean solve the mystery, it also helped shape the future of wildlife science. Drawing from his research in the Gulch, he went on to develop Rothermel's fire spread model, the first comprehensive mathematical system for projecting how wildfires move across different fuels, slopes, and weather conditions. It became the foundation for nearly every fire behavior model used by firefighters today. In that sense, the tragedy at Mann Gulch not only changed training and survival tactics, but also spurred breakthroughs that continue to protect firefighters and communities decades later. I want to wrap up this video and the story of the Mann Gulch fire by talking about Dodge, Rumsey, Solly, and Norman McLean, as all of these men unfortunately are no longer with us today. Norman McLean actually passed away before Young Men and Fire was published, and it took a group of people coming together to get this book actually made and gathering all the information that he dedicated the later years of his life to. I believe somewhere in the book he talks about how the search for the truth of the Mann Gulch tragedy was something that kept him energized and kept him going even in his old age. And he also talks about a younger man, slightly younger than him, that was also investigating the Mann Gulch tragedy and ended up passing away of a heart attack. It literally brought him to his grave because he was researching it so much beyond what his body was able to get into. So I think it was a really good thing for someone who was really dedicated to wildland firefighting and also the National Forest Service to devote the later years of his life to researching the biggest smoke jumping tragedy ever. One of the key things that helped this book be so much more interesting but also held back the answers coming to light was Wagner Dodge's death just 5 or 6 years after the Mann Gulch tragedy occurred, when he actually died of cancer and only made it to 38. Then, once we look at Walter Rumsey and Robert Sully, we get to see two men that survived the tragedy by sticking together, and then they continued to live Forest Service lives after the fact and even helped Norman McLean with his research. Even though they ended up going to the wrong spot, they did give invaluable information to Norman McLean as he was trying to uncover this whole situation. And both of those men lived long lives, but eventually did pass on. Although at the end of this video, what I'm going to end it off with is a memorial to the Mann Gulch smoke jumpers, as long as James Harrison, who, like you know, wasn't a smoke jumper at the time, but did end up helping and losing his life during this tragedy. And that memorial is led by Robert Sully, I believe. I'm going to double check that, but I believe it was led by Robert Sully. Much more than that, the entire culture, science, research of wildland firefighting has changed drastically due to Mann Gulch. First biggest thing is safety is the biggest concern, no longer speed. Like I mentioned earlier in this video, you have the 10 o'clock fire mindset where guys would get on the scene of a fire and their entire goal was just to get it out before the next morning instead of basically their own lives. Now, granted, they didn't necessarily know better, and it was a culture, not just an individual mindset. And now the culture is safety first. And now there are about 10 guide rules about firefighting, as well as 18 lookout situations where men are trained to basically be more aware and consider more safety as opposed to that mentality of just get the fire out. And of course, it is also important to get fires out quickly, but safety first. There's also many safety advances. Tools have been streamlined, as well as radio and communication technology is much better. There are satellite links, and unlike the Mann Gulch tragedy where they only brought one radio and it got destroyed right away, now teams are sent with multiple radios, and there even is some aircraft surveillance going on, keeping everyone connected and safe. Also, smoke jumpers nowadays carry much lighter helmets, unlike the football-style helmets, and also have fire-resistant fabric, as opposed to the wool and canvas normal material that they would set out previously way back in the day. Now it's like all streamlined suit, tools, gear, so it helps them be more effective and safer. There's also a fire shelter that is sent down with every man, which in a way kind of acts as what Wag Dodge did, where he kind of burnt all the ground so the fire went around him. This fire shelter, I believe they basically cocoon themselves along the ground and the fire is able to go past them and not burn them alive, which is worst case scenario. You don't need me to tell you that. So that fire shelter is a huge help with keeping men alive. Now, before I show you that memorial service and get to the end of the video where I just promote myself, I wanted to say that the biggest lesson from Mann Gulch fire is that it's not just history, it was a guiding force for all of smoke jumping and wildland firefighting to this day, and it helps people be safer, smarter, and hopefully put out more fires. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you guys enjoy this clip that puts a name to all the faces of the men that lost their lives in the Mann Gulch tragedy of 1949. Thank you.
And as we move into the next millennium, it's time to rededicate ourselves to the memory of these fine young men and the lesson their deaths taught us, that wildfires are and always will be dangerous. And we must respect its potential to put a firefighter in harm's way. And that life is precious, and for some, very short. And now please join me in a moment of silence in memory of those 13 young men who lost their lives in Mann Gulch. Robert J. Bennett, Eldon E. Diedert, James O. Harrison, William J. Hellman, Philip R. McVeigh, David R. Nabon, Leonard L. Piper, Stanley J. Reba, Marvin L. Sherman, Joseph B. Sylvia, Henry J. Thal, Jr., Newton R. Thompson, and Silas R. Thompson.
And with that, we have the conclusion of the Dark Montana Timeline, Part 1. Part 2 will be coming out within the next week, so make sure you're subscribed with notifications on so you can catch part 2. If you haven't already done it, like the video. It helps out with YouTube's algorithm quite a bit. Oh, and if you haven't noticed, I got this really cool hat. It's a Montana After Midnight hat with my logo that I designed. I previously had hoodies, now we got hats too. So you can pick one up if you're really feeling it. Thanks for watching, I'll see you in part 2.